So if you've been around for a bit, you probably actually see me do a live reading of this article, and I'm probably will have a version of it uploaded to Tumblr, and Substack, and I've decided to do a more like controlled environment by reading it here, and then I'm going to edit it together later so it's more organized. So I'm just going to get it right into it. I'll probably edit in a better intro later. So, spoilers for Hunter x Hunter up to the latest chapter, Chapter 410, as well as spoilers for the 2011-1999 anime. If you don't want to be spoiled, you can come back to reading this later. This version of the article that you are reading is actually the second version, as pointed out by several people on Reddit. In the original article, I conflated the terminologies of Hatsu and Nen abilities at several points. Hopefully with this article, I can clear that up. As mentioned before, I do plan on making a video/audio version of this article at some point. Intro. So, you're probably wondering what's up with the title, since I'm probably not going to go in depth about any one specific ability in this article. Well, this episode was originally going to be about Kurapika and his Nen abilities, how they work and how they metaphorically represent the character, because the way Togashi uses Nen and the respective abilities that can come with it to tell us about the characters and who uses them, their personality, and their place in the story is actually done a lot and very well. But I realized when I started writing the Kurapika article, I sounded completely incoherent. Plus, I kept having to repeat certain ideas or concepts over and over, which left me wondering how much time I would be wasting explaining information or my thought process on each article. So, like with my MTG Color Pie articles, which I am still working on by the way, in addition to the TMA article on the web, I decided to make a general video explaining some of the overall and commonly occurring concepts and distinctions, as well as some common misconceptions before having future articles focus on more individual people or things. Nen has a lot of misconceptions and speculation that are mistaken for fact. I also have my own speculations or assumptions about Nen, but I will try to be clear about when something is conjecture and give the reasoning and or sources. The other thing I noticed is a lot of Nen explanation videos leave me wanting. There are some good videos out there, like one by Nen will review, but a lot of them lack some serious information, don't talk about the symbolism, don't have as many sources, and just don't dive into the nitty gritty as much as I would personally like. Now, will my article cover everything? No. Partially because of the fact that we are still being told new stuff about Nen as the story of Hunter x Hunter continues, and partially for the sake of time and to avoid confusion. We'll also focus on just Nen and not really how it's handled in society, so things like how the Hunters Association tries to keep it secret and the bylaws regarding Nen are for another time. Aura itself. Now, I know a ton of people are probably here to hear about the various Nen categories, but I want to try to start more generally before working my way down to more specific things. Cards on the table, yes, I will be using the Hunter x Hunter fandom Wikipedia to point me in the right direction, but I will also look for the exact chapters the information is mentioned, and I will try to include them as references for you guys. So Nen, what is it? Some of you probably already have an answer. Nen is the life force used as fuel for the super cool Nen ability and magic system of Hunter x Hunter. This is technically incorrect. If you want to be pedantic about the official terminology, according to Wing in Chapter 47, the term Nen actually refers to a technique/martial art that allows one to manipulate the aura that comes out of their body. So, what's being used to fuel all the supernatural abilities is aura, but how this aura is actually controlled and utilized is through Nen. This is also why the terms ordinary person, non-user, and non-Nen user exists. Technically, everyone has aura, as it is literally life force, because if you didn't have aura, you would just die. However, not everyone can use Nen to harness this aura, and that's where the distinction begins to occur. As I just mentioned, every living thing has aura, and by extension the potential to use Nen, because aura is a life energy produced by all living things, including animals. Aura exits the body from various points known as aura nodes. Normally, aura is completely invisible, even if certain effects such as malicious intent can be felt, or certain Hatsu, Nen abilities, and supernatural effects can sometimes be seen by anyone, including non-users, especially when using Conjuration abilities to create tangible objects. By default, aura slowly leaks away from the body. The best way to visualize aura would be as something like a gaseous steam, which is kind of how it is represented in the anime and manga anyway. For most people, Nen uncontrollably slowly leaks out of the body by stemming off the top of their head, like a bit of steam leaking out of a teapot. But by using Nen, especially 10, one can regulate their aura and keep it from leaking away. This comes with the benefit of also reducing the rate at which one ages, while greatly increasing their base strength, making them stronger than non-users by default. This layer of aura acts as a layer of protection against the Nen/aura of others. While Nen is normally invisible, it becomes visible to people once they open the aura nodes in their eyes, allowing them to see it. The same rule about being able to actually see Nen appears to apply to video recordings of it too, as seen in Chapter 56 when Wing and his students review the video of Hisoka's fight with Castro by using Gyo to see aura hidden with Hisoka's In. What In and Gyo are is something I'll explain later, but just know that this shows Nen in videos and probably pictures seem to abide by the same rule of visibility as seeing Nen in person. There are two main ways to learn Nen. The first is the most common and safest through simple practice and proper meditation. However, this is by far the slowest way to learn Nen. Zushi, who is a natural prodigy, is said to have taken 6 months to learn the basic technique of 10, as stated by Wing in chapter 48. This is considered fast, by the way. Most people take at least a year to learn the proper basics of Nen. According to Solkov in chapter 402, it took him an entire year to get to the level of using Zetsu while multitasking when doing something like running and playing a game, despite having been able to use the technique from birth. However, if you are in a bit of a time crunch, there is a second way to learn how to use Nen, but this can be extremely dangerous and is not recommended, so much so that most consider it taboo. This method is dubbed initiation or baptism, depending on the specific translation you are using, and it involves forcing the nodes of one or more people open with a sudden influx of external aura. We have seen this happen both intentionally and by accident. Wing famously gives Killua and Gon a burst of aura to force their nodes open in chapter 48. We also see Gon and maybe Killua accidentally initiate the Chimera Ant remote after the latter managed to survive a blow from one of Killua's thunderbolts and Gon's Jajankan rock attacks before being whisked away by Colt in the events of chapter 191 and chapter 194. As mentioned previously, initiation is considered extremely dangerous, and intentionally using it to teach someone Nen is frowned upon and considered taboo. According to Wing in chapter 48, the reason for this is because anyone who has malicious intent or simply lacked the right amount of experience could potentially just kill or maim the person they are trying to initiate, accidentally or purposely. And we have encountered people who have lost entire limbs or become crippled due to the effects of a Nen attack / initiation. Gido, Sadaso, and Ryavolt specifically. So we know it's very, very possible and easy to become permanently / seriously injured / or crippled or mutilated from an improper initiation. In Heaven's Arena, Nen using participants of the arena will typically practice initiating those who can't use Nen once they reach the 200th floor, often leading to serious injury or death to those that cannot already use Nen. However, that's not where the risks actually end for this method. On top of all this, once your aura nodes are opened, you don't immediately know how to control your aura flow, and you need to quickly learn to invoke 10 or else your aura will just pour out of your body from every open aura node. And since aura is your life energy, if too much of it escapes, you'll become so tired you can't even stand up, according to Wing in chapter 48. It should be noted that while initiation is referred to as an attack, not all forms of initiation take the form of such. The one Wing provides Gon and Killua is known to use a more gentle aura when compared to the likes of Illumi's Nen. We also know even supportive abilities can act as a form of initiation. For example, Kurapika's Stealth Dolphin causes the non-users who are loaned an ability to be initiated. The term attack tends to be used universally as a way to discourage its use, as Kurapika explains in chapter 388. Kurapika even clarifies that an initiation can be achieved through the use of healing or support abilities, not just literal attacks, and we see other characters such as Babiminya and Furika speculate about the use of manipulation to force aura nodes open. However, they also note that in those cases, Nen users would normally be able to see or detect the aura the manipulator in question has infused into the initiate. Kurapika's Stealth Dolphin seems like quite an interesting form of initiation since after Queen Oito was temporarily given a Nen ability by the technique, she later asked Kurapika to teach her Nen, but Kurapika reveals that she was already awakened to it without even realizing, as seen in chapter 369. Something that seems a lot less likely to happen if you got initiated from Gon sucking you in the stomach or something. This could imply more subtle forms of initiation or just Oito and Kurapika being more talented, but I'm going to leave any potential specifics regarding that to Kurapika or Oito's respective articles, because I want to stay on track here. I'm not sure if this really counts as its own category of Nen Awakening, but I decided to cover it in its own little subcategory because I find it distinct enough. Within the Hunter x Hunter world, there are also people known as Nen Geniuses, a term that refers to people who subconsciously control their aura, master techniques, create Nen abilities, or use certain forms of Nen, even if they lack formal or conscious training and knowledge. Wing says that in chapter 48, people that can use Nen, including these geniuses, are often regarded as superhuman, geniuses, gifted, etc. While it would be easy just to come to the conclusion that there are only two states of being when it comes to being able to use Nen, those who are Nen users and those who aren't, it's pretty apparent that this state of awakening exists on more of a spectrum. There are those who can and can't use Nen, but there exist states in between these that are referred to with terms like half-awakened or semi-awakened, in which some of the user's aura nodes are open properly, but not all of them. This can lead to people who have some control over their aura, unique Nen abilities, or have a higher amount of aura to pull from than the average person, but they are unable to see or sense aura in the same way that someone who is fully awakened to Nen would be able to. We see an example of this in chapter 372 from two of Halkenberg's bodyguards that ended up in a state of half-awakening due to the effect of the 9th Prince's Nen beast. They had a lot more aura than normal, so they were mistaken for Nen users, but they did not seem like they knew how to control their aura in the same way as someone who went through the proper training would. They also still had the signature stem of aura flowing out from the top of their heads that non-users tend to have. However, they seemed like they were able to learn Nen and how to manipulate their aura much faster than normal, probably because they were already part of the way there thanks to the semi-awakening. It is mentioned in moments throughout the story that certain forms of manipulation can be used to fully or partially awaken someone to Nen by forcing aura nodes open or closed for whatever reason. But we'll try to save more of that talk for when we go over the Nen categories. Also, according to Longi in chapter 401, if a baby becomes awakened to Nen in some way, such as by a psycho dad putting a curse on them from the moment of their birth, they will instinctively and naturally learn Ten and Zetsu as a way to reduce fatigue. As mentioned previously, all living things have aura, which means all living things have the hypothetical potential to use Nen. The clearest example of this would actually be the chimera ant Yuppie, Yuppie for short, who despite his humanoid appearance and mannerisms is said to be made without a single drop of human genetic material, as we see mentioned in chapter 266. As explained by Wing in chapter 56, Nen tends to be heavily connected to the practitioner's own character, so just attempting to copy the Nen abilities of someone else would not always reach the same result or level of efficiency, even if there would be specific instances where someone could reach such a goal. Aura can also be used to convey emotion and intent, as we have seen on several occasions. One of the most notable ways in which this is done is by imbuing it with malicious or hostile intent to create a palpable force that can actually seriously harm those that cannot use Nen, or those without proper protection such as Ten in a physical and or mental sense. It is noted by Wing in chapter 48 to have been physically painful for Gon and Killua to endure hostile intent without Ten. We have also seen people like Killua describe Wing's Nen as a lot less malicious and more gentle when compared to someone like Illumi. Due to how strongly aura is tied to Nen, one's aura output or Nen capability can spike or change in response to strong emotion. This can come with the risk of straining the user or other such drawbacks. Tying into Nen and aura's connection to emotion, there is post-mortem Nen. Despite being powered by life force, some Nen abilities or effects can actually become stronger upon the death of the user. The most common reason for this happening is because of a powerful emotion, like a powerful grudge, being present in the user when they die, causing their aura to seek out the source of their hatred and cling to it, as explained by Finks in chapter 120. Post-mortem abilities fueled by negative emotion and the death of the invoker tend to be extremely hard to remove. There are those known as exorcists who have the ability and skills needed to remove Nen curses, but they are extremely far and few between. Even more so when it comes to those capable of removing curses set by those who are now dead. Finks states that the number of those who can remove curses left by the dead can be counted on one hand, but the wiki states there are 10, and I still need to find a source for the wiki's claim. However, I was able to find more else, seeing the Hunters Association has a grand total of 1 exorcist among their ranks in chapter 325. So the point stands that Nen exorcists are extremely rare and hard to come by. Not all post-mortem Nen abilities are necessarily malicious or only take the form of curses though. The GU family are aided by Misha Hao's post-mortem Nen ability, one which aids in the inconspicuous disposal of corpses from any victim killed by the GU family, the act of controlling the deceased body to make it seem like a murder didn't just occur in public before moving the body to a location where it can be disposed of safely, as seen in chapter 392. So, post-mortem abilities can take the form of blessings and or curses along with more neutral manifestations. Sometimes a user's death can act as a condition or requirement for an ability to work in order to make it much more powerful or effective than it otherwise would be. As mentioned previously, aura is present in all living things, which means being able to use Nen and interact with aura allows for connections or attunement with nature and various living things. There is a common belief that good hunters are well liked by animals, most likely because of their connection to Nen and aura, and wild animals are implied to often have a greater sensitivity to aura generally. Some people and animals can also spontaneously learn Zetsu, and human babies who are initiated will instinctively learn and use Ten and Zetsu to keep their aura from leaking away. In chapter 186, Kite notices that Killua and Gon are using their skills with Nen to quote, become one with nature and more in tune with it, unquote, and use their 5 senses to catch things a non-user would otherwise miss. This association with nature also makes sense when you consider that aura can be used to convey intent, so someone with Nen would probably have an easier time conveying when they are not upset or harboring no malicious intent to wild animals. Before we finally get to some of the more flashy Nen techniques and skills, I think it's important to cover Nen and its relation to genetics and even gender. It is implied that skill or potential with Nen can be passed down. The Zoldyck family all appear to be powerful Nen users, especially Killua and his father along with his grandfather. Ging and his son Gon are both powerful Nen users, and Beyond is a top tier Nen user just like his father. Things like this could just be a mere coincidence or the product of other factors, such as training being passed down, but I would be extremely surprised if that is the case, even if it doesn't seem like being the descendant of a powerful Nen user guarantees you'll be a Nen god, and being the child of someone who doesn't know Nen doesn't seem like it automatically damns you to a fate of Nen mediocrity. There are certain aspects of Nen that seem innate, such as one's Nen type, but a lot of these factors are a mystery or can vary, such as when influenced by strong emotions. We see that with characters like Gon and Killua that people can have the same amount of potential or skill, but excel in different aspects of Nen. For example, Gon is noted as having more raw power and aura, but Killua more finesse and control with aura, as noted by characters like Bisky, who compares Gon to a diamond and Killua to a sapphire in chapter 139, using this metaphor to interpret how they are different personality-wise and excel at different things. In chapter 141, Bisky also states that Gon has a better concentration and recuperation, but Killua has better analysis and fundamentals. Potential, however, does not guarantee someone will become a powerful Nen user if they lack proper training or discipline. One can also have their Nen growth stunted by spending too much time training the wrong Nen categories, for example, as we see with Castro and his fight against Hisoka during chapter 54. However, despite the conclusion this could lead one to having, Nen and Aura do not appear to be sexually dimorphic in any way despite how certain characters may talk about it. For example, Kurapika notes that male enhancers are more likely to have combat-oriented abilities in Chapter 388, and female enhancers are more likely to have supportive or healing abilities. But in Chapter 386, the bodyguard Babiminya confirms that Nen talent has nothing to do with sex/gender or physical capability in response to Kurapika going out of his way to teach a smaller-sized woman Nen first as a way of showcasing this aspect of it. The best example for what Babiminya is talking about would probably be characters like Bisky. Even Bisky's smaller form, she was capable of overpowering a full-grown man that might be like twice her size, such as Benno in Chapter 137, despite her smaller frame and stature. Her true form is also much bigger with an absurd amount of muscle, physical power, and strength granted to her by her training. So what gives? Well, Nen and Aura are heavily connected to the mind, and sometimes things like certain restrictions or rules can occur in one's Nen based on their own biases, intuition, and or personality. Objectively, based on what we know, a female enhancer could be just as powerful as any male enhancer, for example, but the conditioning of society could affect their own personality and biases. If a woman is convinced she cannot ever overpower a man, or that women are naturally weaker but faster, then her Nen ability is more likely to reflect this, and vice versa, for a man. But this is a pretty extreme example, though. More subtle examples would be things like occupation or culture. Things like combat are less likely to be seen as ladylike, and some cultures associate femininity or womanhood with support or domesticity, which would encourage more supportive or less conflict-oriented abilities. However, the opposite can be the case for men, with the clearest example being Prince Benjamin's private army being entirely composed of men, and men being more likely to be associated with modern military and thus put into environments where they are encouraged to make combat-oriented Nen abilities. So yes, it is at least implied that a woman could be just as physically strong as Uvagen or Netero using Nen, and it is only mental blocks, personality preferences, or biases that would prevent this from being the case, not inherent biological ones. And even Bisky doesn't have a combat-oriented Hatsu. Her Hatsu takes the form of Cookie, and who can do things like, make you feel less tired and help with skincare. So Nen, Aura, and Nen categories do not discriminate between genders, nor operate with any kind of Wheel of Time-esque power system or logic amongst men and women. Although, despite what I said, if the comments about Netero being in his prime during the events of the Chimera Ant arc in Chapter 202 are true, then age does seem to be a factor with Nen. And as you get up in years, you will pass your prime and become weaker in some ways. And it's possible Netero is playing up this decrease in strength in some ways given some of his jokes.
A dubious little creature getting up to mischief. This is no good.
Although, to me, this could potentially make sense since Aura is life energy. So it's possible that when you start getting really, really old, you have less life force. But this is just speculation on my part on why this might be the case. Basic Nen techniques. Okay, I think that's about everything I wanted to cover about Aura in general. If I missed anything, I'll probably just make a second video clarifying things or a Q&A. I know that a lot of people are excited for the Nen categories so that they can assign themselves cool abilities and stuff, but like I said earlier, I'm trying to go from the most general stuff to more specific and character-dependent things. So let's start with the most basic Nen techniques and what are known as the four major principles: Ten, Zetsu, Ren, and Hatsu. The four major principles do have an order in which you are usually supposed to learn them, with Ten usually being the first, Zetsu the second, Ren the third, and Hatsu the fourth, so I'll tackle them in that order. Once a person opens their aura nodes, the first technique they should learn is Ten, because it is the ability to shape your aura and the one that's used to keep your aura from leaking away from your body. It not only provides basic protection against the effects of other people's Nen and aura, but it also considerably slows the rate at which one ages and strengthens their body, since your life force is no longer leaking away. While Ten does provide some protection against Nen attacks, it is a very rudimentary and basic defense, so it provides a lot less protection against physical attacks that are bolstered by aura, even if it does protect against aura imbued with malicious intent, more mundane physical attacks, and it is better than nothing. According to Wing in Chapter 56, Ten is like riding a bike in that once you learn how to do it, you will never forget. Zetsu is the next technique to learn, and it involves completely stopping the flow of aura from the body. This is different from Ten because Ten itself keeps one's aura from leaking away from their body, but Zetsu stops aura from exiting the body altogether. This makes the user a lot harder to detect because tracking them via Nen becomes a lot harder if there is no aura to follow, and it also makes the user a lot more sensitive to and aware of the aura of others because the user themselves is not surrounded by their own aura. This makes Zetsu pretty useful for both tracking and hiding, allowing the user to better feel and sense the aura of others without the metaphysical barrier that is their own aura between them and the world around them. According to Wing, Zetsu also increases the rate at which you can recover from exhaustion because you are conserving aura and keeping all your life force in your body. However, before you start wondering why anyone would ever leave Zetsu, the technique comes with some major downsides. First of all, since there is no aura surrounding you, the user becomes way more susceptible to attacks, and you are leaving yourself completely defenseless to the attacks as well as the aura and nen of others. Even just malevolent intent or weak attacks can prove devastating, as displayed with how Killua and Wing react to Gon's invocation of the technique in Chapter 50. While the use of Zetsu boosts your ability to sense the aura of others, the technique itself involves closing all your aura nodes across your body, including the ones in your eyes, a fact that leaves you unable to actually see aura even if you can better detect it or use your other senses. So Zetsu is definitely a high-risk, high-reward type of technique to use. Next is Ren. Ren is all about outputting a larger amount of aura than with normal Ten, and then projecting it outwards. This comes with the benefit of increasing the user's physical strength and durability more than Ten otherwise would, and provides a larger pool of aura to draw upon for various abilities and techniques. While all Nen abilities invoke Hatsu, some Nen abilities can only be used while incorporating some form of Ren because of how much aura they draw upon. If one were to simplify things by considering a Ten a defensive technique, then Ren could be considered its offensive counterpart. However, I consider this to be an oversimplification because the defense provided by Ren is actually greater than that provided by Ten. Personally, I would say it's more accurate to consider Ten a more passive version of Ren, and Ren a more active version of Ten. It's like comparing running to walking, but maybe that isn't as helpful. Through the article so far, I have mentioned the idea of infusing aura with bloodlust or using aura to project bloodlust in a manner that can physically and psychologically harm others. This is where Ren comes in, since that effect is usually created when you combine feelings or intentions of hostility with Ren. This can produce uncontrollable dread, paralysis, and presumably death without the protection of something like Ten. Neutral Ren is rarely felt by those incapable of using Nen, but malicious Ren can very easily be felt and affect such non-users, especially those the motions are aimed at. Ren is also often used as a show of power and/or to intimidate other Nen users by showing off your raw strength. Ren can also unconsciously reflect hostility without the user intending to do so, and it can leave faint traces of aura or evidence in the environment, even after a Nen user has left the area, which is implied to be possible by Silva in Chapter 98 when he points out that Chrollo is skilled enough to leave no traces of his aura while hiding. The downside of Ren is that it expends a lot more aura and stamina than the likes of Ten or Zetsu, and Ten seems like it can be maintained basically indefinitely, which does not seem to hold true for Nen users in regards to Ren because of the fact that it takes actual effort to maintain. It is possible to increase the duration of your Ren with practice, and by extension the amount of aura you have at your disposal when using Ren. According to Bisky in Chapter 201, it usually takes about 1 month to extend the use of one's Ren outside of combat by 10 minutes. This would also imply that combat or other intensive situations can lead to Ren lasting for less time or burning out quicker. Training with Ren seems to just involve trying to maintain your Ren for as long as possible, like a kind of exercise. In Chapter 57, Gon and Killua figure out that, if timed correctly, you can use Ten to capture some of the extra aura made with Ren, by using Ren to create a burst of aura, and then perfectly timing Ten to capture the extra aura generated from the boosted flow. Although I have to assume this version probably would generate less aura to use overall, even if it is probably easier than maintaining Ren constantly. Finally, there's the most exciting and talked about Nen technique amongst most Hunter x Hunter fans, Hatsu. Now I will be discussing Hatsu in a broad sense as opposed to any specific abilities or Nen types. Hatsu is described by Wing in Chapter 60 as being one's personal expression of Nen, and to be the act of projecting one's aura to carry out a specific function in the form of a paranormal ability. One's Hatsu and their Nen qualities are influenced but not restricted to the Nen user's own natural Nen category, with Nen categories determining how strong or effective certain Nen types and kinds of abilities you use can be. The term Nen ability refers to a specific application of Hatsu to create a unique effect that cannot always be cleanly ascribed to any of the basic or advanced Nen techniques, even if they can involve their use or invocation. There are 6 Nen categories: Enhancement, Transmutation, Conjuration, Specialization, Manipulation, and Emission, and one's natural category can be discovered by using Ren during a water divination test, which seems to be considered an application and practicing of Hatsu in and of itself. You cannot choose your Nen type, but you can become more skillful in using one or more Nen categories with the right exercise and training. Once you reach a certain level, then you have the skill to create an effective and useful ability. Also, yes, your Nen ability can involve the use of more than one Nen type and thus fall under multiple Nen categories at once. Nen techniques can vary wildly. Some are so intricate and unique they can't really be cleanly ascribed to any of the 4 fundamental techniques or advanced ones at a glance, while others are so baby simple they are basically just an enhancer using a co-infused punch, stapling a restriction onto it, like only being able to use your right hand or having to chant something, and then giving it a name. Uvagan, Big Bang Impact. I think people overcomplicate the idea of a Nen ability in their head within the Hunter x Hunter fanbase, and convince themselves that all abilities have to reach some level of complexity or uniqueness, when in truth it doesn't always take much to make a Nen ability. Sometimes it's as simple as slapping a condition restriction on a basic or general Nen technique and boom, Nen ability. I also have to imagine that what is considered a complete ability can vary from user to user due to variance in personality and what they want their actual ability to be and do. According to Wing in Chapter 56, it tends to be best for someone to make their own Nen ability, as one can never truly master Nen if all they do is copy techniques. Even people who steal or borrow Nen techniques have a specific, more unique ability that allows them to do that, such as Chrollo's Bandit Secret. Having the same technique is fine and all, and we have seen characters with the exact same Nen abilities, such as the ability Yomotsu Higui, we who were born out of convenience amongst the have-nots of the Kaki population, and Second Prince Camilla's Guard. But not only do you have to consider your affinity for each Nen type, but it's vitally important that the Nen ability in question feels right and intuitive to the user themselves. Gut feeling and instinct apparently form a very important part of developing an ability with Hatsu. In Chapter 60, Wing's Hatsu training just seems to involve performing the water divination test repeatedly so you can find your Nen type before performing the test over and over. The result of the test seems to become more pronounced the more ore you can muster with Ren during the test, and the goal is to produce more extreme results. For example, when Killua first does the test, the water tastes a little sweet, but after some practice, it tastes as sweet as honey. I assume part of the reason for this training is to practice mustering enough aura to actually perform potentially more aura-intensive Nen abilities in Hatsu. As I mentioned earlier, this is actually an updated article since in the original article I conflated Nen abilities in Hatsu. Thanks to Reddit users like user Mango Turtle, user Flat Caterpillar, and user Super Metazoid, to avoid any further confusion, I'll do some extra effort and explain the difference here. So all Nen abilities are applications of Hatsu, but not all Hatsu are Nen abilities. Hatsu more so seems to refer to the use and application of Nen types and qualities, which in turn lets you create Nen abilities. If you're a transmuter like Killua, Hatsu is referring to your ability to invoke transmutation in order to transmute your aura and/or perform the water divination. And you can use this ability to create a Nen ability by virtue of using transmutation. While Nen abilities tend to be more unique, not all applications of Hatsu are as such. For example, the water divination test produces very specific results for each Nen category, unless you're a specialist of course. In Chapter 200, we see Palm accidentally invoke Hatsu, and presumably Ren since the effect matches that of the water divination, to cause a cup of coffee to overflow even though none of her actual Nen abilities seem to have any similar effect. Gohan is able to identify her as an enhancer due to this invocation of Hatsu. So while Palm is not using a Nen ability, she is invoking Enhancement to generate this effect. So basically, all Nen abilities fall under the Hatsu classification, but not all Hatsu are Nen abilities. The important thing here is I don't need to change the name of the series. Advanced Nen Techniques. Okay, we'll touch on Hatsu Nen abilities again when we cover the various Nen types, but first I think it's important to learn about the advanced Nen techniques as well, since it is important to consider these and how they may inspire or interact with each other, various Nen abilities, or the 4 basic techniques in general. Also, Wing teaches Zushi, Gon, and Killua some of these techniques before they get around to developing their abilities, despite explaining the concept of Nen abilities first. So I feel like it makes sense to explain these before Nen types so we can avoid doing an awkward U-turn later. It seems like every advanced Nen technique is a variation or specific application of the basic Nen techniques and/or some combination of 2 or more. First we have Gyo, which Wing introduces in Chapter 56. A useful technique that is an advanced application of Ren, in which the user concentrates a larger than normal portion of the aura flow to one specific body part. This has the benefit of increasing the strength and defense of that body part at the cost of leaving the rest of the body more vulnerable, due to aura being taken away from them to maintain the Gyo in said target body part. Most interestingly, when Gyo is used on the eyes, it boosts their efficiency, and allows the user to see aura and Nen constructs concealed with techniques like in addition to traces of aura that would otherwise go undetected, as seen in Chapter 85 when it's used by Gon to identify aura-infused objects that couldn't be seen by him or others without the technique. One of the Chimera ants in Chapter 233 seems to describe Gyo as having a glowing effect when used on said body parts to those who can see Nen. The Hunter x Hunter wiki states that there is an alternative version of Gyo that relies only on the aura naturally leaking from the body to function instead of Ren, but I'm having trouble finding a canon source for this, so if you know the chapter where this is explained, if at all, feel free to tell me. What the wiki could be referring to is when Gon uses Gyo in Chapter 85 despite lacking the usual visual indicator or Ren aura effect on the eyes, but I'm not 100% sure. As you can imagine, while this version of Gyo does supposedly still increase the amount of aura and strengthen the affected body part, its effectiveness is lower than its more standard counterpart. It may not be as effective at countering techniques like In, but the wiki claims it can be used to see thin layers of aura and perform the water divination test. Bisky's Gyo training, as first revealed in Chapter 136, involves Bisky randomly holding up her finger and shaping her aura into a number that is hidden by In. The students must be able to recognize what Bisky is doing and use Gyo to see and tell her what number is being made as fast as possible. In the case of Gon and Killua's training, the person that failed to do this, or was just slower in doing the task than the other person, had to do some sort of punishment, such as push-ups. In is an advanced form of Zetsu, as explained by Wing in Chapter 56 when he reviews Hisoka's Heaven's arena battle against Castro. However, unlike Zetsu, it does not completely halt the flow of aura and stop it from spilling out of the body, but merely hides it to render it hard to perceive. It can cause all or parts of one's aura to become invisible even to other Nen users, making it very useful for sneak attacks and laying traps, in addition to use in combination with Nen constructs created via Transmutation and/or Conjuration, as seen with Hisoka and Kurapika when they use it on the transmuted bungee gum in Chapter 56 and Conjured Chains in Chapter 82, respectively. We also see Uvogan, an enhancer, use In to deliver a sneak attack on Kurapika. It does not make Aura completely undetectable because of the fact that hidden Aura can still be rendered visible to a Nen user using Gil on their eyes, and the use of Zetsu can make one sensitive enough to Aura to detect Aura concealed within, even if this maneuver is much more dangerous than using Gil, as explained by Wing in Chapter 56. Also, if you're an experienced enough Nen user, you can sometimes just put 2 and 2 together. For example, if there's little to no Aura being felt coming off of someone in the heat of an intense battle that should require burning a bunch of Aura, you can probably surmise they are using something like In to conceal some or all of their Aura, and instinctively use Gil or Zetsu to counter it. En is an advanced application of both Ten and Ren, as explained in Chapter 94 when Nobunaga uses it. Usually with Ren and Ten, the Aura only takes up a small space within a few centimeters around the user's body, but En allows one to extend the reach of their Aura beyond that of what is normal for them by using Ren to generate more Aura than normal, and then Ten to shape and mold that more plentiful Aura. Most En is typically molded into the shape of a spear, although characters like Neferpitou are known to have irregularly shaped En. P2's En in particular is described as resembling tendrils that could extend up to 2 kilometers or 1.24 miles, as Mora observes in Chapter 259. So it is possible to produce more irregular shaped and less circular En. En is most useful as a means of detection, since it allows the user to feel the shape and movement of anything within the area covered by their Aura. How well and detailed the information conveyed by this technique is dependent on the skill level of the user. This technique can prove useful in sorting Nen users from regular people, since Nen users are more likely to notice and react to the wider reaching Aura. It's not explicitly stated, but considering the technique involves Ren and given how Neferpitu's En seems to have negative effects on characters like Nav, I think we can safely assume that En can be imbued with malicious intent or hostility like normal Ren can. As you could glean from a technique that makes use of Ren, using En can be extremely tiring because of how much Aura it drains. En does seem to have a concrete definition within the world of Hunter x Hunter, as Chapter 237 tells us that the minimum distance that Aura needs to be stretched for it to be considered a successful usage of En is one that has a radius greater than 2 meters, or about 6.6 feet, that's held longer than 1 minute. A radius is the distance from the center of a sphere to its circumference/edge, in case you don't know. This is just the minimum requirement for being able to use En. Some who master En can shape their Aura into a circle with a 50 meter, 54 yard, 2 foot, 0.5 inch radius, but some people are capable of going even further. Neferpitu's En could not only reach very far, but they can also maintain it for several days at a time, while Zeno Zoldyck can give his En a radius of 300 meters, or about 328.084 yards, as the assassin reveals in Chapter 98. Finks also implies En has weaknesses outside of just being tiring for the user to maintain in Chapter 400 when talking with Feitan. According to Finks, using it in a crowded area can cause a sensory overload for him, and he needs a ton of concentration to maintain it. So much so that Finks cannot move while maintaining it. Additionally, Finks likens using En around so many hostiles to be like walking into a slum with nothing but a sign that says shoot me. Some of these weaknesses are clearly just because Finks is not as proficient at using En as some other characters. For example, I would assume characters like Zeno could probably move while maintaining En, and characters like P2 and Zeno seem less prone to sensory overload given the size of their En. But it does confirm that En typically requires a ton of concentration, and can give away the position of a user or overload some users with information. Shu is an advanced application of Ten that allows users to shape their Aura around an object and use said object as an extension of their own body, as we see in Chapter 140. This coding of Aura strengthens and protects the affected object in the same way it would one's body, and it can be combined with techniques like Ko, as we see Bisky, Gon, and Killua use them in combination with rocks during Bisky's enhancement training in Chapter 145. In Chapter 140, Bisky had Gon and Killua learn and practice Shu by making them dig a straight tunnel from one area to another. This also required them to dig through mountains. During this exercise, they figured out that the key to succeeding was using Shu to envelop their Aura around their shovels, which strengthened the tool and made the digging process much easier. Ko is considered a combination of all 4 fundamental basic techniques, including Hatsu, along with Ten, Zetsu, and Ren, in addition to the advanced technique Gyo as explained by Bisky in Chapter 141. Gyo is used to focus Aura into a part of the body, before Ten is used to prevent it from scattering by shaping it. Zetsu is then used to completely stop the flow of Aura to all other parts of the body, further boosting the area where all the Aura is concentrated, with Ren being used to generate even more Aura for the area to use. As you can imagine, this ends up acting as a trade-off. One part of the body is made extremely powerful and well defended by Aura, but it leaves the rest of the body without the protection of Aura. The role Hatsu plays in Ko is less clear, but it might be involved in doing something similar to invoking Ren with a wider divination test to generate results. The application of Hatsu may also come from a potential invocation of enhancement to further reinforce the area that Ko is being used on, or it can come from the idea of like Hatsu being used to direct something for a specific purpose, which we do know Hatsu encompasses more than just net abilities, so there's that too. Ko can be used defensively technically, but it's most commonly used offensively, since one wrong move means that any other unprotected part of your body can be hit and damaged by even a presumably weak Nen attack, if we assume the rules of Zetsu apply. But even a slow-moving Ko seems very powerful, as Bisky demonstrates to Gon. According to Bisky, Ko can be made dozens of times more powerful when combined with user speed and strength. It is also implied that major disparities in strength can lead to one Ko overpowering another, even if both the defender and attack are using it properly. Ken is described as an advanced form of the base Ten and Ren techniques, as explained by Bisky in chapter 141. It is a more defensive technique where the user maintains a state of Ren for a prolonged amount of time. And we can assume Ten is used to help shape the aura, but I couldn't tell you for certain if the only qualification for being considered Ken is just being able to maintain Ren for a certain amount of time as opposed to in burst, for the sake of aura production and defense. The amount of aura surrounding the user is stated to be approximately 10 times higher than when they are just using basic 10. Given this higher output, it only makes sense that Ken takes even more effort to maintain and can be tiring to keep up. Ken is more even than Ko in terms of aura spread, and is thusly typically used as a defensive technique, since it allows for a higher level of protection than that of 10 from attacks and or aura, but is safer to maintain than Ko for prolonged amounts of time, because it doesn't leave any part of the body completely undefended. And Bisky goes as far as to state that it is the best technique for defending against Ko because of this balanced defense across the body, even if it doesn't completely block all the damage a Ko attack inflicts. Ken is also helpful when a Nen user just wants to be cautious. Some Nen users can expend the radius of their Ken to produce a sort of miniature pseudo-N in order to better sense incoming attacks that they may otherwise miss or be unable to react to. Presumably Killua is doing this in chapter 237. And Gon also performs this against Knuckle in chapter 210. In chapter 141, Bisky has Gon and Killua practice Ken by having Bisky herself strike at them really slowly with Ko, and the other students properly maintain the Ken as a form of defense. According to Bisky in the same chapter, if a combatant can't hold the Ken for at least 30 minutes, it's not worth using as an option in combat. Ryu is when someone uses Gyo in a state of Ken to perform real-time defense and offense adjustments, as Bisky goes over in chapter 142. Ko dedicates 100% of one's aura to one body part for the sake of offense or defense, and Ken splits aura evenly across all parts of the body, so Ryu is used to redistribute aura according to any other percentage. For example, you could focus 70% of your aura into your right fist and leave 30% of it to protect everywhere else. This can be very helpful when it comes to damaging someone using Ken without leaving the attacker completely undefended outside of a single body part with Ko. However, as one can imagine, Ko is still stronger thanks to the greater risk and more aura being channeled to a single body part for use, since Ryu still spreads out the aura. Ryu is described as difficult to master because it not only requires precise control over the flow of one's aura with enough accuracy, but you also need to be able to estimate the amount of aura being used by the opponent on the fly. You could perform the technique correctly and still get screwed over if you don't move the aura involved in Ryu fast enough. Too slow of an aura flow can also give away your moves. In chapter 142, after completing the Ken exercise by performing it successfully for 30 minutes, Bisky has Gon and Killua practice Ryu by doing slow motion sparring with each other. They spar while moving extremely slowly so that the defender can practice allocating their aura properly across their body in response to an attack for the sake of defense, and the attacker can practice allocating their aura for attacks. This exercise is essentially to help participants get the timing down. Ideally, this exercise helps the student properly use and allocate their aura when using Ryu in split-second decisions. One thing I didn't mention in the original versions of the article is that Bisky describes Ryu as the foundation of Nen fighting. So one thing I want to stress is how important Ryu is to fighting in Nen, because she points out earlier that if all you use is Ken, you might not have the strength to be able to damage someone. So if you're both just using Ken, it'll just become a fight where potentially you guys can't hurt each other. So Ryu is how you guys can hurt each other without using Ko and leaving your parts of your body defenseless. General Orthodox Nen training. Now that we have some of the basic and advanced techniques out of the way, we might as well circle back to the Orthodox Nen training and go into it with more detail. Ideally, since you now know what every basic and advanced technique is, you can understand what it does and why it's learned without me having to explain each concept individually repeatedly. Again, I'm going to be focusing on what we know about standard or quote proper unquote Nen training that most people go through, as opposed to initiation. Most of the information we get on some of the more standard Nen training procedures comes from the Kaki and Prince Taradnik's training, as well as some of the training Kurapika has his class perform, even if it was a bit more focused on aura control in order to prepare the class for their initiation. So Kurapika's class isn't one-to-one by his own admission, and we can't rely on everything we see within it, but plenty of it seems true and to have tangible benefits. As mentioned earlier, standard Nen training starts off with meditation exercises, as explained by Wing. In fact, when Nen is first introduced, Zushi and Wing use the idea of Nen of the Flame being just a type of meditation in chapter 46. In chapter 375, Verge's comment about Nen implies that at least some of the broader public knows that a concept called Nen exists, but they just believe it to be a mental technique that allows for abnormal amounts of strength than would otherwise be possible for the practitioner, as opposed to anything that can control aura flow or allow for the creation of objects from seemingly thin air. I bring this up because it sort of ties in with some of Nen's beginner training. While it doesn't seem to be a requirement, sometimes the martial art Shingen Ryu Kung Fu is used as a precursor to actually learning Nen. In chapter 46, Wing tries to pass off the 4 basic techniques as simply being meditation exercises, with 10 being a focus on the mind, reflecting upon the self and determining a goal, Zetsu being to put into words, Ren being intensifying your will, and Hatsu being to put into action. Thanks to what I discussed in previous sections, we know that this is mostly a lie because these concepts are actually referring to different techniques for controlling the flow of aura. However, the concepts of these meditation exercises have a kernel of truth to them, and by Wing's own admission in chapter 46, he didn't lie to them, and says that the Nen he told them about helps prepare the spirit. Hello, Doug from the future. Just so you're aware that, yes, I am aware that the translation on the screen, Wing is saying it helps strengthen the mind, even though I'm saying it helps strengthen the spirit. That's because the translation you're seeing on screen is a more accurate translation, although I feel like the meaning is still the same here, where Wing is saying that practicing on the flame can help strengthen your willpower and prepare your mind for Nen. So, and also just letting you know for any future reference, if there's like a very slight discrepancy in the specific terminology I'm using and the words you're seeing on the screen, that might be because I'm using a better translation now than I was before. So I just want to be transparent about that. Also, for clarity, when I say, so it was the translation I was using for the article, but I have since gone through and with the article and corrected any like major mistranslations or anything. So this video should be fine and have better translations, and that's why some of the screenshots you see in this video are different from the ones you see in the article. But the meanings should be the same. I went back and checked to clear up any mistranslations or mistaken meanings, so everything should be fine now. In chapter 51, Wing tells Killua and Gon that while Gon was not allowed to use actual Nen, they can practice Nen of the Flame every day using these meditation principles in its place. And in chapter 52, Wing notes that Killua and Gon's control of their aura has gotten better with improved smoother Ten, despite Gon and Killua honoring their word and not using Nen for 2 months. So while some of these meditation concepts are ordinarily useless red herrings to lay people, it seems that they can produce actual results when it comes to learning how to control your aura with Nen, when applied to the proper learning process. Due to how strongly aura is linked to one's mental state and emotion, it seems like proper meditation can be used to get better at Nen without utilizing true Nen or aura manipulation. Although it's clear that this meditation isn't a permanent substitute to actually practicing real Nen with real aura. Since Wing offers to allow Killua to do Nen exercises with him and Zushi in chapter 51, after he barred Gon from using Nen for 2 months, and Gon and Killua do practice actual Nen again. When it comes to Nen, the point of starting off with the meditation exercise is to allow students to gradually become more aware of their aura flow before their nodes are open. We can assume that this way you can avoid a situation that might occur with a sudden initiation in which all your aura nodes are open, but you have no way to control your aura flow. So said aura just spills out and leaves the user exhausted. In Shingon Ryu martial art, the point of the Ten step is to help hone the mind and improve the flow of one's Ten, as we can clearly see in Gon and Killua's training under Wing. However, since Gon and Killua were initiated and Zushi was already well along the process, we get some of the more standard Nen training process later in the series. In chapter 370, Oito does a meditation exercise that involves the student closing their eyes, putting their index fingers slightly apart, and then moving the tips of said fingers closer to each other until they feel like they are pushing against something. The point of this exercise is to gauge the student's natural talent and predisposition towards aura. The farther apart one's index fingers are from each other when they begin to feel a pushing sensation, the higher their talent for aura is, and seemingly how long it will take them to learn Nen. Which, to be clear, the farther apart your fingers are when you feel the pushing sensation, the less time it will take you to learn aura. As we see Bill comment that Oito seems like the type of person who will probably take a lot of time to learn Nen after seeing how close together her index fingers are when she feels the sensation. Another exercise we see is one meant to teach the basics of aura manipulation while allowing someone to learn to feel their own aura, even if the student still doesn't have the ability to actually see it. This stage appears in chapter 366, when Theta has Tyradnik put both hands in front of his chest and imagine a ball floating in between them as a way to practice aura control. Even though Tyradnik gets the hang of this in a few moments because of his incredible talent, Theta expects him to take 3 10-minute sessions each day over the course of 10 days to get the hang of it. And she comments that if he's lucky, he'll get it in 5 to 7 days. This would imply that for most people, doing 3 10-minute exercises means it will take them 10 days to pass this part of training, while a more talented person can take 5 to 7 days. And outliers like Tyradnik can take even less time. In chapter 362, one of Prince Lazarus' guards tells him that on average it takes about 1 year for someone to gain the ability to see aura. But we know that more gifted individuals can learn Nen much faster. In chapter 368, Theta says that while the average person takes at least a year to learn Nen, it's possible for someone to learn it in half the time, so about 6 months. And in chapter 48, Zushi, who Wing states is a natural prodigy, took 6 months to learn the basics of Nen. Learning to open every single one of your aura nodes and being able to control your aura seems to take about 1 year after 3 hours of proper basic exercises every day, according to Furikov in chapter 388, after seeing Kurapika awaken one of his students to Nen. As I touched on previously, Ten seems like it's usually the first technique that is learned to keep one's aura flow from leaking away. This is done by learning to contain one's aura around them, little by little through meditations and breathing exercises, as Kurapika alludes to in Chapter 388 when explaining Nen to one of his students. In Chapter 56, after Go and Kyo get the hang of 10, Wing sees to prioritize teaching Ren and then Gyo, an advanced form of Ren, next as a way to be able to produce enough aura to utilize more advanced techniques and perform Hatsu. But part of the reason for this could be because Go and Killua already displayed that they knew how to use Zetsu. Gyo also seems useful for perceiving more residual aura, or aura hidden by In and such. Hatsu training, as covered earlier, seems to involve doing the water divination test over and over while attempting to produce more extreme changes in the water and or leave, which Wing has his students do in Chapter 60. Kurapika also alludes to Hatsu training involving breathing exercises in Chapter 388. In Chapter 123, Wing tells Gohan that he should practice his Ten and Ren daily because they are the foundation for more advanced techniques. Hello, this is Duck in the Future. I just want to also clarify that part of the reason Wing tells Gohan to focus on Ten and Ren so much is yes, they are fundamentals, but also because Gohan is an enhancer. And enhancers have an equal balance between attack and defense. So, I just thought it's important to mention that. Nen conditions, limitations, risks, activation requirements, etc. One of the most important aspects of Aura and Nen in Hunter x Hunter is that of limitations, risk, and vows. Since Nen is a product of the mind and the personality, thoughts, and mental state of someone can all influence one's Aura and Nen. I would argue that the line between a condition, limitation, risk, and activation requirement can be a bit blurred, nebulous, or even kind of synonymous sometimes. But the wiki goes over them individually, so I'll break the topic up into the same categories. For the sake of the wiki and this article, a condition is basically a trade-off that makes an ability stronger, or potentially even possible in the first place. Unlike limitations and vows, it doesn't seem possible to break a condition normally. A limitation is a sort of Nen pact in the form of an additional cost or a drawback to strengthen an ability, while a vow refers to promising to uphold that pact. Activation requirements are the conditions an ability needs to meet in order to be used, and a risk is basically what it sounds like. The more of a risk you take when doing something, like leaving yourself open to an attack, or having to say a chant, the stronger the resulting Nen tends to be. When creating a Nen ability, it's possible to include conditions. Sometimes conditions are used to strengthen a technique or to compensate for a lack of skill in some area. For example, in Chapter 108, Kurapika explains that he can only use his judgment chain while his eyes are scarlet. The reason for this is that the ability requires the use of emission and manipulation to maintain the chain at a distance and impose its rules. So ordinarily, Kurapika wouldn't have the force and accuracy needed to pull that off. But combining this condition with the buffs Emperor Time grants boosts the efficiency that Kurapika has when using each Nen type, but not his affinity for them, and allows him to use this ability. Conditions can be used to exceed what would normally be possible to achieve without the trade-off. In Chapter 83, Izunami tells Kurapika that it's impossible to make something like an unbreakable chain with Conjuration, but something quite close can be conjured with the proper conditions, limitations, and vows. Some conditions are more like active choices on the part of the user, and certain kinds of techniques actually need specific conditions to function at all. For example, in Chapter 379, Fink states that spatial teleportation abilities require something called marking, meaning someone cannot use Nen to teleport somewhere they've never actually been to themselves. In Chapter 50, Wing implies that manipulating an object usually or always requires a strong connection/relationship to said object, such as Gudo controlling his tops. And even though Gudo is an enhancer, he is using manipulation in addition to enhancement on his tops. So there isn't someone who can use manipulation to go around controlling anything and everything without some sort of condition, limitation, or activation requirement, even if it's as simple as needing to touch an object or only being able to control certain things. Shark's experimentation with Greed Island cards and objects in Chapter 134, using the Nen abilities of Shizuku and Kortopi, seem to imply that conditions cannot be broken or ignored. This is different from limitations that can be broken but at a great cost or drawback. Despite what one may first assume, not all conditions and limitations are made via conscious choice. Earlier I mentioned how some kinds of abilities just straight up require certain conditions to even work, but sometimes conditions can manifest naturally or based on what feels right to the user. For example, Chapter 76 reveals that like any other emitter, Franklin could just fire aura projectiles out of his hand, fingers, and other such body parts. However, he cut off the tips of his fingers because he felt it would be more effective, and this self-imposed condition increased the power of his double machine gun ability. Another even more passive example of a condition can be seen in the manipulation ability Order Stamp. Despite being stolen by Crollo, it is still bound by some of the original owner's personality and sense of right and wrong, as Crollo explains in Chapter 352. While Crollo doesn't see any difference between a human corpse and an inanimate object, such as a puppet, the original owner of the ability did, and as such, Order Stamp does not work on human corpses, because they register as people instead of objects to the ability, although conjure copies of corpses count as valid inanimate targets. The original ability's creator also defined a puppet as a non-living object with a discernible head, so if something doesn't have a head, it cannot be affected by the Nen ability, and if a once eligible puppet loses its head, the ability will stop affecting it. Another common condition we see are abilities that require some sort of object or other medium to use. There's Melody and her flute for her music, Hisoka needs a thin plain surface, such as a piece of paper or napkin, as explained in Chapter 55, in order to use his texture surprise, Illumi and his needles for the use of his manipulation, Sherlock and both his phone and antenna for black voice, etc. Sometimes it's possible to use unbreakable conditions to your advantage because it seems like many, if not all of them, are passively active even when the user themselves is unaware of something that would otherwise break the condition of their ability. For example, Shizuku's Blinky cannot stick up living objects and/or objects made with Nen, so it can be used to help detect traps or living survivors, and the vacuum seems to be bound by this condition, even if Shizuku herself is unaware that something didn't meet the ability's conditions, which Sherlock uses to his advantage when experimenting on Reed Island. Some conditions don't limit when an ability can be active, and what it targets, but rather act as a drawback, additional cost, or just extra strain on the user. For example, Kurapika says in chapter 364 that for every second he has it per time active, 1 hour is shaved off his lifespan. Another type of restriction many abilities have is an activation requirement. This can be as simple as Illumi needing to stick at least one of his needles into someone, to having to explain your Nen ability to something much more complex. In chapter 253, Leon reveals that the Inamura ability he's borrowed can only be used on rainy days. Some activation requirements only need to be met whenever you activate the ability. However, some need to be constantly met for the duration of the time the technique is used. For example, the order stamp I mentioned earlier will cancel if the thing it is controlling loses its head despite being eligible as a puppet previously. As I touched on earlier, some activation requirements are common or needed for certain kinds of abilities to work at all. When Zeno and Silva are fighting Chrollo in chapter 98, Zeno notes that stealing abilities usually requires the one doing the stealing to meet 4 or 5 conditions, and deduces that Chrollo is a specialist, once again pointing to the idea that it's a reoccurring restriction amongst people with similar abilities. Sometimes it is possible to create or find loopholes to circumvent specific Nen restrictions, or at least loosen them a little bit. For example, in order to use abilities stolen by Bandit's Secret, Chrollo needs to have the book open to the page. This prevents Chrollo from using certain Nen abilities that require the use of both hands, since one hand has to hold the book open, and it means Chrollo can't use any abilities while the book is closed. However, in chapter 351, Chrollo reveals the bookmark ability Double Face. This ability allows him to bookmark a page and use the ability on the marked page, so he can free both his hands for an ability or use two abilities at once if he has the book open to one page and the bookmark on another. I should make it clear that there's still definitely limits to this, since Chrollo seems to have only one bookmark and cannot just use a countless number of abilities at once. Chrollo also manages to find some loopholes with Order Stamp. The original user's morals prevent Chrollo from just commanding the puppets to kill someone, but he can command them to break someone instead to get them to mortally wound a target. While Order Stamp cannot be used to control corpses, it can be used to control recreations/copies of corpses. The existence of loopholes like this sometimes leads to readers/watchers of the series trying to find ways to circumvent them or poke holes in the logic of this aspect of Nen. I remember seeing one comment trying to argue that Nen made no sense because you could do something along the lines of saying, actually, my ability would be a different color every time I use it, to dramatically boost its strength. But this argument is born from a massive misunderstanding of how restrictions like conditions, limitations, etc. work in Nen. First off, Nen is connected to willpower and intent, so if you purposely make a restriction that you know will not really matter or you just plan to easily circumvent without any issue, then it will be less effective. Not to mention, as pointed out in chapter 83 by Izunami, we know vows, limitations, conditions, etc. grow stronger the more strict they are. Saying I can only use this ability every other day will yield a weaker result than saying if I use this ability at all, I will die. So if you just plan to create a restriction where you are picking from an infinite range of colors that have slight differences in their shade, the boost would be minimal to non-existent at best, given what we know. And the same would probably be true if you said something like, I can't use this ability in space, knowing damn well you aren't planning on going to space and the chance of you just ending up there is impossible. According to Izunami in chapter 83, the act of creating and having a rule you must abide by is known as a limitation, and the act of actually swearing to commit to said limitation is known as a vow. Unlike other conditions or activation requirements, which need to be met for the ability to even function seemingly, limitations can actually be broken at the risk of some sort of punishment, losing the capacity to use the Nen ability involved, or losing the ability to use Nen altogether. Adding additional catches such as the loss of your life if you break a vow can further empower a Nen ability. So you might ask, why doesn't everyone walk around making a bunch of vows to boost their Nen? Well, first, as I mentioned, the vow becomes more powerful the more conviction you have behind it, and the more of a drawback it actually is. So to make an effective vow, you need a good balance of making sure your Nen ability is actually usable for whatever its purpose is, while having a significant enough vow to actually give it the proper amount of strength it needs to get the job done. If the vow is too weak, there might just not be a point in having it, or you've just limited your ability for no reason. If the vow is too restrictive, it might hinder you more than it helps. So it's a double-edged sword that needs a careful balance. In the case of Kurapika, his chain jail can only be used on Phantom Troop members, and using it on anybody who is not currently one of the Phantom Troop members will cause Kurapika to just die. So this limitation allows for an incredibly strong chain that even Uvagen, the strongest of the spiders, an enhancer who could tank direct fire from rockets and bullets, could break out of. According to Izunami in chapter 83, Had Kurapika not also added the stipulation that using his chain jail on anyone who's not a member of the Phantom Troop would result in his death, then the ability would not have worked as Kurapika intended, due to lacking the proper strength. It's also important to remember that chain jail has a pretty hefty limitation, since at most the spiders can have like 13 members, so that's 13 safe targets out of the entire population at any given time, and that number has a chance to be less, especially if you're actively killing members of the troop. However, limitations can be weird, and they don't always guarantee that those using them can manage to get a big enough boost for the task at hand. Additionally, in Chapter 83, Izanagi says that exceeding 100% of one's normal capabilities comes with risks. Going past your natural limit always comes with drawbacks, and increasing one's strength usually comes at the cost of something else that can create weak points, drawbacks, or even fatal results. So most Nen users lean towards more stable and consistent methods, and this is probably why something like Emperor Time drains Kurapika's lifespan. I would think of it like how pushing your body past its physical limits can strain it. Since Aura and Nen are tied so heavily to emotion, mental state resolve, and willpower, one's Nen strength can sometimes fluctuate in response to strong emotional states. As I mentioned earlier, self-imposed rules can actually increase the effectiveness of a Nen ability, such as the vow Kurapika made for his chain jail. And in Chapter 254, Moral addresses the possibility of Leo using his earbuds to boost the effectiveness of his ability by increasing the risk of using his ability via cutting off his sense of hearing when he does it. As mentioned earlier, in places like Chapter 83, we see determination is also an important factor with risk and conditions. Basically, you have to actually mean it and be willing to follow through with it. Trying to trick your Nen into being more powerful or something isn't going to work. Determination is also partially what made Kurapika's chain jail so powerful. In Chapter 211, Knuckle postulates that part of what makes Gon's Jajanken so strong is the added risk in taking the time to charge the attack while chanting the rock, paper, scissors, Jonken Pon, and Gon sacrificing his defensive power by focusing Aura into his fist. While risks do help boost the power of abilities, it seems like conditions or limitations can boost the power of an ability even when there's little to no risk. For example, Gon taking extra time to charge his Jajanken against Razor during the dodgeball match in Chapter 165 seems to cause a spike in Gon's aura and power, as even other characters seem caught off guard by the strength of the aura despite having already seen Gon's Jajanken rock previously. Although I guess you could argue that taking more time to charge the ability at least gives Razor more time to react and prepare as an added risk, even if Gon had all the time in the world to sit there and charge his power due to the rules of the dodgeball game. That all being said, upon thinking about it a little bit more, I would actually assume most of the power here is coming from Gon's determination and emotion, rather than just risk. As mentioned earlier, we've also seen intense emotion increase or influence the power of Nen. An example of this would be when Morel asked Gon to attack him in Chapter 223. Thinking about Kite's death and mutilated corpse leads to Gon having a massive influx of aura, and Gon apologizes before admitting that he really was determined to kill Morel in that moment, which is something that also could have influenced the attack's power. So basically, an activation requirement are the conditions you need to meet in order to even use an ability in the first place, while a condition is basically what an ability can and can't do. A limitation and a vow are added stipulations added onto an ability to increase their power, force, accuracy, etc. And a risk is just how much of a risk you're taking when using an ability or performing a certain action. Conditions seem like they cannot be broken, while limitations and vows can be broken by some sort of cost or drawback. And of course, an activation requirement is what you need to meet in order to use an ability in the first place. So obviously, if you don't meet the activation requirement, you can't use the ability in question. In order to help visually conceptualize how restrictions really work in Nen, I think of it all like a water and hose. The Nen is water flowing through a hose, and by tightening the nozzle or the hose itself, you're restricting water flow. But in return, the water exits the hose with more force and accuracy thanks to the increased pressure. However, the water spray covers less area and requires more accuracy. This is just a metaphor I use, not one used in the series, but I think it's apt because aura is likened to steam, a form of water that can also become more intense when put under pressure. Okay, this is Doug from the future again. I'm not sure I did the best job explaining the restrictions on Nen, because Finks does refer to marking as a kind of activation requirement. So I just also want to once again circle back to the fact that if you ask me, the exact line between a condition, a limitation, activation requirement, etc. can be kind of blurred and nebulous sometimes. And activation requirement is a kind of condition, is a type of condition within this more simplified framework that I've been using, which I think I should have probably done a better job explaining that. Nen Chart. Now that's the last of the general techniques and aura information. So you might be asking, is it time? Oh yeah, buddy, it's fucking time. Everyone bust out your Nen charts and what Nen type am I quizzes. If you're feeling it, put your own Nen ability in the replies or something, I don't know. Because we are talking about the Nen types. For the sake of clarity, I will be reciting some of the stuff I talked about previously, even if I want to keep it brief when possible, because there are actually a lot of misconceptions around Nen types. Before we go into the specifics of each type, let's start with the Nen chart. So as you know, there are 6 Nen types, and they are arranged on a chart in a sort of diamond-esque shape. I guess it's technically more of like a hexagon. Starting from the top and moving in clockwise order, we have Enhancement, Transmutation, Conjuration, Specialization, Manipulation, and Emission. Everyone is born with a natural affinity for one Nen type. What this means is that everyone has a 100% affinity/aptitude for one of these 6 Nen types, and 80% affinity for the ones right next to their category on either side, a 40% in the category furthest from them, and a 60% in the remaining 2 categories. So if I was a transmuter, I would have a 100% affinity for transmutation, 80% for enhancement and conjuration, 60% for emission, and 40% for manipulation. At this point, you're probably wondering why I didn't cover specialization, since one would assume a transmuter would have a 60% affinity for specialization because, like emission, it is 2 categories over from transmutation on the chart. Well, specialization is a unique Nen category that has its own rules and lack thereof. So a transmuter would have a whopping 0% affinity for specialization. Only specialists can utilize specialization, and I'll explain the nuances of that in greater detail later. So all these percentages are cool, but what do they actually mean for Nen users and the Nen chart? Well, according to Kurapika in chapter 108, each of these percentages are a rough approximation of how efficient a Nen user would be at utilizing any given type. It is possible to use abilities that do not fall under one's own Nen type, but generally it is best to try to stick to your own Nen type, or at least include said Nen type somewhere in your abilities if it involves multiple types. As you can tell by all these percentages thrown around, the farther a category is from your type, the less efficient it will be, meaning it will be less effective and weaker than if you stick closer to your own Nen category. Plus, learning techniques of Nen types that aren't the ones you have a natural affinity for will just take longer to learn. In chapter 108, Kurapika translates affinity to levels as a metaphor that could potentially imply that some kinds of techniques require a certain level of affinity, force, and accuracy for the Nen type to even use, or at least be effective in any meaningful way. I haven't found anything really expanding on this idea, outside of the idea that techniques become less efficient the lower your affinity and mastery for a Nen type is, in addition to Kurapika saying his chain jail doesn't work when his eyes aren't red. Trying to copy Kurapika's chains as an enhancer wouldn't make a lot of sense for most people because of the decrease in strength and efficiency in the technique. Not to mention that it would take longer to learn because the farther away a Nen category is from your own, the more time you would have to commit to mastering that category when compared to your own. A concept we see explored with Castro when Wing explains that the problem with Castro spending so much time developing a complex conjuration and manipulation ability with his double despite being an enhancer. The best example of the nuances in Nen type would actually be thanks to Kurapika's specialist ability, Emperor Time. Once again, I will go into specialization in detail later, but Kurapika is a special case in that he is a conjurer that becomes a specialist when his eyes turn scarlet. This gives him an access to a special ability called Emperor Time. There are a lot of fans who think this gives Kurapika a 100% affinity for every Nen type, but this is not actually what it does. As you can see above, what actually happens is he basically gains a perfect force and accuracy when using Emission, but in respects to the affinity of being a conjurer. So he can use this as a convenient point of reference. If Kurapika uses Emperor Time, he gains a force and accuracy equal to that of a level 4 emitter, because, as a conjurer, Kurapika's affinity for Emission is 40%. However, a level 10 emitter, i.e. someone with 100% affinity in Emission, presumably in addition to the proper training, would still run circles around Kurapika's own emission capabilities, and potentially perform certain emission abilities that Kurapika couldn't. Even if Kurapika could outdo a novice enough emitter, someone who isn't good enough with the category, or someone who lacks a high enough affinity for emission. However, a special Togashi Yoshihiro exhibition puzzle exhibited in Tokyo on October 28, 2022 to January 9th, 2023 featured a Nen chart with some interesting placements. Also, I just want to point out that apparently, according to this, Alkago's an enhancer, apparently. Even though I'm pretty sure he's using conjuration and manipulation mostly. I'll let you ponder that one. That's... Anyway, the Nen chart would be as you expect in many ways. It's in the same order as always with the hexagonal pattern. However, if you linger on it, you quickly notice that while plenty of characters sit directly on each category, some actually sit in between them to varying degrees. This might lead one to assume that it's possible to have some sort of dual affinity, or have a hybrid affinity split between 2 types, but this is not the case. It is only possible to have one affinity at a time, and even characters who change affinities, like Kurapika, are only one or the other at any given time. So, Kurapika is a conjurer most of the time, and when his eyes are scarlet, he is a specialist. He is not a specialist and a conjurer while his eyes are scarlet. What this chart is meant to show, according to my findings, is the idea that you can lean towards an adjacent affinity, but you're still stuck with whatever your natural category is. Let's take the butler Goto and our protagonist Gon for example. Gon is a quote pure unquote enhancer, while Goto is an enhancer with a lean towards emission. What this is displaying is the rates at which the characters learn and pick up emission and enhancement techniques. Gon learns enhancement techniques as fast as you would expect, and presumably Goto would learn enhancement techniques quickly too, but Goto would also learn emission techniques faster than Gon because of his own leaning. So a character that sits smack dab in between these two categories, like Franklin, isn't someone who has a 100% affinity in both or 90% affinity in both, but rather a 100% affinity in one and an 80% affinity in the other, like always. It's just the rate at which Franklin can learn and master Emission and Enhancement would be more even. Despite this, they would still have a primary affinity that follows the rules of the Nen Chart Placement. The character Bisky does actually make reference to these leanings in canon Hunter x Hunter. In chapter 148, Bisky estimates that Gon has a slight lean towards Emission, since he seems to learn Emission faster than Transmutation, despite both of the subsequent categories being an equal distance from Enhancement itself. And she mentions that he's way better at learning Enhancement than Emission. While not directly stated in the manga, as far as I remember, it does seem possible for these leanings to change, since while Bisky believes Gon to have a lean towards Emission, Togashi places him as a pure enhancer. It's possible Bisky was just wrong, but since Gon went from skillful to extreme to Nen lost in the exhibition, there's the implication that how proficient one is with Nen can change, and it's possible that Nen type leanings are something that can also change over time or under specific circumstances, even if Nen types themselves usually can't. So on the screen what you're going to see is, here is a supposed translation I found of the puzzle on Reddit. I don't know who translated it, so I can't tell you if it's accurate. I didn't use it as a source, but it matches up with all my other info, so here it is for the curious. I will put a link for it down below. The puzzle also divides the skill level of each Nen user into 4 categories. From lowest to highest, it goes Skillful, Excellent, Natural, and Extreme. Gon is also given the level of Nen Lost after the stunt he pulled against Neferpitou. Characters like Bisky and Netero are classified as Extreme. Neferpitou, Mindyupi, Shiapoof, Hisoka, and Illumi are categorized as Natural, Nob and Knuckle are given the Excellent rank, and characters like Morel and Razor are listed as Skillful. Now this isn't a comprehensive list of every character and where they place, just me trying to give you an idea of what each tier is like, and who sits there. There's no evidence that these are the only tiers of skill. I mean, Gon has Nen Lost when no one else does, and Razor along with Morel definitely aren't pushovers, or that skill classifications like these are necessarily used in universe. I imagine these are for the sake of the exhibitionism and our convenience, since only characters with enough presence in the story seem to be placed. Rest in peace, Reed Island pirate NPC actor. Togashi will answer for what he did to you. Finding your Nen type. But what if you have a character that needs to figure out their natural Nen type? Are you just supposed to guess and see what feels good when you're trying to make your abilities? Well, this is where the water divination test comes in. There is also Hisoka's personality test, but the water divination seems like the most accurate test so far. The test involves getting a cup, filling it with water, and then putting a leaf on the water so it can float within it, as seen in chapter 60. You then put your hands around the glass, one on each side, but I don't believe we have ever seen someone touch the glass with their hands, before using Ren, Gyo, or any other technique that focuses enough aura into one's hands. This causes certain effects to occur, with each effect signaling the Nen type of whoever is taking the test, although we do see Palm create an effect that matches the result of an enhancer performing the divination in chapter 200 with a cup of coffee accidentally. Whether this means you can perform the divination with any liquid, specific substances, or water is just used to more easily determine the results, or something else is unclear. If an enhancer performs this test, the volume of the water rises. Transmuters will cause the taste of the water to change, emitters will cause the water to change color, conjurers make impurities appear in the water, manipulators cause leaf on the water to move, and if someone produces any kind of effect outside the specific ones listed, then they are a specialist. It also seems like certain effects can hint at the personality of the user or what abilities they should or can develop, especially in the case of specialists because their abilities could potentially be anything, and they don't always get to choose it. Okay, so in the original version of this article, I say that sometimes specialists don't get to choose their Nen ability. We actually don't know how often specialists get a say in their ability. It's never really clearly stated or shown, because sometimes people just develop Nen abilities naturally. For example, Kumugi's an enhancer, but she got her ability to help her play Gungi. So how much say specialists get in their ability is kind of unclear. And just to be clear, I know some people are going to bring up Morena and Borkson, because Morena's entire plot line is that Borkson is a specialist, and Morena wants to choose basically what ability Borkson will get by helping mold her and shape her and push her in the right direction. But the thing there is that Morena is accounting for her contagion, giving Borkson a specific ability. So we don't know if any specialist could do that. Basically. We don't know that if you got a specialist early enough and you help like mold and shape them, that they could develop the ability to basically whatever. That could just be because Morena has contagion. So, an example of what I mean regarding personality is that when 4th Kakin Prince Saradnik performed the water divination test, he caused the water to boil and release a putrid scent in chapter 376 that seemed to take even him aback. Although I suppose Saradnik might be an example of a specialist not choosing their Nen ability. He just got one naturally. This means he is a specialist, and this particular result is noted as being a very sinister omen. I'd go as far as to say that some of the results characters get when performing the water divination may have a bit of symbolism or metaphor to them. For example, Ceradic makes the water boil. The reason people boil water typically is to kill germs and disinfect the liquid itself along with anything within it, such as ingredients used in cooking. So you could see this as relating to Ceradic's goal to separate the supposedly useful trash of society from the useless trash, and discard the latter. In essence, he wants to purify society in the same way boiling purifies water. However, the putrid scent gives a hint as to how malicious and destructive Ceradic actually is, and how he views society, since we know that he was both a serial killer and omega-level sexist. As pointed out by Twitter user at AOS863999742 on Twitter, it could also be a reference to the chapter of Revelations in the Bible, a chapter that includes a demon who falls to earth and poisons the water supply with its mere presence. As told in Revelations 8:10 through 8:11, the third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers, and on the springs of water the name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Togashi is also no stranger to Christian iconography. I mean, there's a guy named Crollo Lucifer, and the Phantom Troop have a parallel to the 12 Apostles, with Ahsoka being an extra Judas traitor. Also, one of Ceradic's Nen beasts literally has a 666 on its belt/stomach, so the comparison to Satan or demons is not unwarranted. In the future, when I go over specific characters, do not be surprised if I bring up their results in the water divination test. There are some other examples I could bring up and theorize about. For example, when Killua performs a water divination in front of Wing after some training in chapter 60, he makes the water so sweet it's compared to honey. This could reference how Killua juxtaposes his more heartless family members, by literally being sweeter and more palatable, or just his extreme love of sweets such as chocolate. In the anime, when Gon performs the divination for the second time in front of Wing, he causes the water to not just overflow, but also begin to break the vessel, which could be possible foreshadowing to when Gon overdoes it with Nen by giving up everything and forcing himself into a grown-up adult form to face Neferpitou. In a sense, both these situations end up with Gon using too much aura and breaking a physical vessel. So I think the narrative does like to use the water divination as a bit of symbolism or character exploration. Also, yes, as I've implied, it does seem like the results of the water divination scale to how much aura is being mustered by the person performing it. If you're not proficient enough with Nen to perform a strong enough Ren, Gyo, etc., then nothing would happen. But passing this ambiguous threshold will cause changes in the water and/or leaf of the divination, with the changes becoming more pronounced the more aura is used for the test. Hence why Gon and Killua's results are more extreme the subsequent time they perform them after some practice. Hopefully you see some of what I mean. If not, I do plan to go over the various Nen types from not just a literal perspective, but also a potential metaphorical or narrative perspective, both when covering each individual Nen type and with our next method of affinity discernment. Unlike the water divination, by Hisoka's own admission, this personality test method isn't perfectly accurate, and he compares it to using something like blood types or zodiacs to figure something out about a person in chapter 62. He also implies he just sort of does it for fun/entertainment. Whether the comparison to blood type/zodiac personalities adds or takes away from this method's credibility can depend on who you ask, since to some this would mean the method is vague at best, if not completely inaccurate, if that's what we are comparing it to. But this is a world with invisible magic martial arts, so sure. And Hisoka not only accurately gauges Gon's Nen type during their Heaven's Arena battle, but also correctly deduces that Bisky is probably a transmuter in chapter 158, based solely on her mannerisms when she hides behind a tree. I actually won't go over the personality types Hisoka assigns to all the Nen categories in chapters 62 and 63 until I go through each Nen type individually, because I feel like it flows better, and it will be more interesting that way. There is a third and, as of now, final way of determining the Nen type of someone. However, this seems to be used after someone has learned Nen for a while and developed certain patterns or habits in their aura, as opposed to something being used early on in one's development. According to Furikov in chapter 370, it is possible to judge one's Nen type through observation alone with enough experience. It should be noted that these are very slight and minute differences, so not everyone has the skill needed to just eyeball someone's Nen type, and Furikov does also mention skill level, which implies that the results can be more or less pronounced depending on factors, such as skill level, and it probably isn't 100% accurate. By default, most enhancers and transmuters have a soft and quiet 10 around the part of their body that activates their favorite attack. Emitters and manipulators tend to have a broader 10 that will turn a shade darker if they attempt to shrink it. Additionally, manipulators usually want to keep the hand they use for their abilities free, and that usually ends up being their dominant one. And conjurers have a stronger 10 around the body part that activates their favorite abilities, but a gentler flow of aura everywhere else. Like manipulators, they usually want to keep their dominant hand free. We don't get anything for specialists, but I would assume given how varied the category can be and function from person to person, there isn't as reliable or consistent way to tell based on subconscious aura flow alone, since it would kind of just depend on the specialist in question, and it could resemble other Nen types or look like something completely different. In chapter 369, Furikov reveals a way to separate non-users from Nen users too. The iris of a Nen user shakes at its circumference/edge when viewed from the side. I have to imagine that, like with his method of defining Nen types, these differences are very slight, since if they weren't, everyone would probably be trying to use them. But it's also possible that it's simply not a well-known method. The weakness of this method is that it cannot differentiate fully awakened Nen users to those who are only half awakened. This would also lead me to assume that it doesn't tell you their skill level. What causes the shaking circumference of the iris is beyond me. Maybe it's the effect of the aura nodes or something else entirely. And we don't know if someone who can't see Nen would notice these details in the iris of a Nen user. And just to clarify, we know Furikob's method can't tell those who are partially awakened to Nen and those who are fully awakened to Nen apart, because in chapter 372, Furikob is under the impression that Hulkenberg's bodyguards are just doing a really shitty job at pretending to be non-users, before it's explained that they were not taught Nen or fully awakened to it by Prince Hulkenberg's Nen Beast. We can tell as the audience that despite the greater amount of aura they have, they don't know how to use Ten until they were taught by Kurapika. Now I finally feel comfortable enough getting into the individual Nen types. I will be going in clockwise order of the chart, starting with Enhancement. The exception to this will be Specialization, since I feel like it will make more sense to cover it last. I will also be discussing the personality types Hisoka assigns each Nen type, and I will not only be discussing the Nen types with what they can literally do, but what they might symbolically or metaphorically represent in the narrative, and /or the characters that fall within them. I will also cover any misconceptions I feel are common or pertinent enough, and I will try to my best to emphasize the differences between each Nen type. Luckily for me, Enhancement is one of the most straightforward Nen types, so it's a good one to start with. Enhancement involves using aura to boost or increase the natural abilities of an object or one's own body. One of the most straightforward ways in which this is done is by simply using the art of Enhancement to boost one's own strength and or durability, such as with Gon or Uvogen, but it can be used to enhance the properties of other objects and not just yourself, like how Gudo does with his tops, and we have seen this category invoked for things outside of just straightforward super strength. For example, Enhancement can be used to boost the growth of one's body to do things like heal it unnaturally fast. Kurapika uses Enhancement to give the holy chain of his thumb the ability to heal injuries, such as when he used it to quickly repair the arm that Uvogen fractured during their fight in chapter 84, with Kurapika stating it uses Enhancement to achieve this. The character Bill is an enhancer that can use Area Giron to greatly accelerate the growth of living things as well as improve the Nen abilities of Nen users. In chapter 388, Bill uses this ability to make a seed within a cup sprout in mere moments by enhancing its rate of growth. However, there exists evidence to suggest that Enhancement can do even more. The evidence takes the form of the character Dogman. Dogman is an enhancer who was granted a Nen ability by Morna's specialization ability Contagion, as revealed in chapter 405. This ability he now has grants him a supernatural sense of smell that allows him to smell the Nen type of someone within 5 meters, and smell if they've been awakened to Nen if they are within 2 meters of Dogman. Now what exactly different Nen types smell like, or Nen user smells of, is beyond me. While it's not completely impossible that Dogman is an enhancer using a different Nen type, he didn't actually learn Nen like an ordinary user. He was granted this ability by Morna's Contagion ability. And so far, all the abilities we have seen granted by said specialist ability match the Nen type of those who are affected. So all conjurers seem to have Conjuration abilities, and emitters, emission abilities, etc., with no other abilities being included. So, it's, for example, we've seen a conjurer get a Conjuration ability, but it's just Conjuration, no manipulation or enhancement being combined with the ability. Dogman being able to boost his sense of smell does fit in line with the description of Enhancement as a category that's about boosting a target's existing natural properties, as alluded to in chapter 60. Such as a sense of smell, and it could explain why Togashi lists characters like Komugi as enhancers in his exhibition. It's possible that what Komugi is enhancing is one or more sensors that her body has, or some other less obvious trait like reaction speed. This also helps us distinguish Enhancement from the other Nen types a bit better. While Transmutation and Conjuration change or add things, Enhancement only emphasizes physical attributes an object already has. If a target is solid, it can be even more solid. If it has strength, it can become stronger. If it can smell better, which would also imply Enhancement cannot be used to boost qualities that something doesn't have. So if you have literally no sense of smell, it stands to reason you couldn't enhance it using this Nen type, because there's nothing to actually enhance. It would also imply that the more something has as a quality, the more there is to enhance. So if you're already physically strong, there's more strength for your enhancement to boost. Or if you already have a good sense of smell, there's more to boost there. And we do know that factors like physical condition can matter with things like Enhancement. A lot of people ask if Enhancement can be used to change the properties of something, such as making skin metal, but there's no evidence for this being the case. You would only be able to reinforce the changes and processes that the object is naturally going through, like growth or regeneration. Even then, I don't know if you could say enhance the rate at which metal rusts or something. This leads me to assume that for example, you couldn't enhance the air until it becomes like a solid wall, since the air lacks any form of solidity, but feel free to debate the prospect of enhancing air resistance or something in the comments. Despite all this nuance though, most enhancers and enhancement abilities seem pretty straightforward and involve using aura to enhance the natural abilities of one's own body, such as strength, durability, or senses. The enhancement affinity is also usually thought of as being the best for combat, since even when not using their Nen abilities, an enhancer can more easily just overpower or outlast their foes by reinforcing their body, and having a good spread of offense and defense. Uvogen was one of the best enhancers we have ever seen, and he could tank both shotgun rounds and anti-tank missiles in Chapter 75. Hello, Future Doug here again. Uvogen tanks sniper rifle rounds in the scene I am thinking of, not shotgun rounds, which just goes to show you what a top-tier enhancer is capable of, although the rocket does still cause Uvogen pain. This overwhelming strength usually leads to enhancers having more simplistic techniques. For example, both Gon's Jajankan Rock and Uvogen's Big Bang Impact could easily be mistaken for something like a simple Ko by someone less well versed in Nen or audience members despite the actual versatility and or power behind them. I imagine part of what makes enhancement balanced is also its place in the Nen chart. The category opposite to enhancement is specialization, and as I mentioned earlier, specialization works differently from other categories. You either are or aren't a specialist. You can't be a non-specialist using specialist techniques. This means that non-specialists will always have a 0% affinity for a specialization anyway. This leaves an enhancer with a 100% affinity for enhancement, 80% for transmutation and emission, and 60% for manipulation along with conjuration, meaning they don't have a category at a 40% affinity, and they have at least a 60% affinity for the most common Nen types. Enhancement is also quite the interesting Nen type because of some remarks about gender. I won't go over that in detail again since I went over the concept of Nen being influenced by gender/sex in this very article. So here's a shorter summary. In Chapter 388, Kurapika states that female enhancers are more likely to have supportive abilities, while males are more likely to have combative abilities, see Uvogen, making male enhancers with supportive abilities like Bill more of an outlier. This doesn't seem to be a biological difference, but rather culture, society, or life experiences influencing how demographics are more likely to use their Nen, although there is mention of keeping your body in good physical shape being a factor when it comes to strengthening one's body. But by that same token, we know that practicing Nen can lead to unnatural levels of strength. Bisky, a transmuter, is super muscular and strong thanks to her Nen experience and training. So we can assume with Nen that even if you do want to subscribe to a strict sexually dimorphic physical strength, the highest level of strength male and female Nen users could achieve is the same. So basically, even in this hypothetical, we can assume that the strength caps out at a certain point. When it comes to the water divination, the specific translation I use of Chapter 60 describes enhancers as causing the volume to change. While this could normally imply that some enhancers make water level of the test go down, we've only seen the water level increasing. Examples of someone having their affinity for enhancement proven by a water level dropping has never been mentioned within the text or outside of it. So for now, I'm just going to assume that enhancers specifically cause the water to rise when taking the test, and I assume this is also what other translations tend to do, is that the water specifically rises. Bisky also proves useful in understanding the Nen types because she assigns each Nen type an exercise that's meant to help someone get better at the aforementioned type. In Chapter 145, Bisky gets Gon and Killua to practice their enhancement by using Shu and Ko to coat the aura around a rock before focusing all the aura flow into the rock to boost the durability of the rock they are holding, and smashing other rocks with it, which does once again confirm that enhancement can be used on things besides the user's own body if there was any doubt. The goal of the exercise is to smash 1,000 rocks a day without the practitioner's own stone breaking. If they manage to achieve this, they move on to the next level of training. If the rock shatters before that, they have to keep practicing at level 1. Although, they can only try this practice once a day, because according to Bisky, you should only train in one type per day because basic training should be the primary focus. And the repetitive motion and stress of performing this exercise seems to cause the performer to become less focused and lose concentration, according to Killua. The fact that Shu and Ko are used for this enhancement exercise also helps display how Nen types can have an impact even outside of specific Nen abilities. According to Hiso's personality test in Chapter 63, and an omnibus that I cannot verify but does not seem to contradict any of the info I see in the manga, enhancers tend to be simple and straightforward in action and thought. They tend not to lie while generally being selfish and focusing on their goals. Their techniques often reflect straightforwardness by being very simple and uncomplicated. Enhancers tend to have a very soft and quiet tend around the part of their body that activates their favorite attack. Before we move on to the next category, I have to ask, what are some of the themes of enhancement? To me, there's a very obvious narrative with a sort of stubbornness and unwillingness to quit. This makes sense because enhancers are all about reinforcing and exaggerating traits that are already there. Something as reflected in how during the water divination test, they caused the level of the water to increase, and in the anime, Gon seems to create enough water pressure to break the glass used for the test. I have always been under the assumption that they are somehow increasing liquid strength or pressure somehow in order to make it rise. It makes sense that they would gravitate towards straightforward and emotional personalities with this in mind too. Almost like they are the type to enhance and exaggerate their own feelings and emotions. The straightforwardness also makes sense from the angle that enhancers aren't just creating something like with Conjuration, but building upon what's already there in some way. However, it should be restated that not all enhancers are like this, and there are some exceptions. You could have a thoughtful and rational enhancer or one with a super complicated enhancement ability, even if it's not as common. Enhancement often has a very physical quality since it seems like it's simply restricted to physical objects. which makes sense too. Their 10 being soft and quiet around the part of the body that activates their favorite attack is probably just a straightforward representation of how they usually rely on boosting the traits of one or more body parts and or the object they interact with. Transmutation. If you take the water divination test and you find that the water and the leaf seemingly haven't changed in any way, then you should try tasting a bit of the water like Hwat did in chapter 60. You may find that even though the water looks and acts the same, the taste is now different. This is the mark of a transmuter. The use of transmutation allows one to change the properties of their aura in order to have it mimic something else, as we explains in chapter 60. However, unlike with say Conjuration, you can also mimic individual properties of specific things instead of recreating the entirety of an object. It's clear based on the various characters we've seen that transmutation can be used to give one's own aura one or more properties of naturally occurring elements, like with Killua was electricity, body parts like Sadaso's arm, man-made substances such as rubber and gum, with Hisoka's bungee gum, animals like Xeno's dragons. Xeno is an emitter, but he seems to be using transmutation for the dragons, etc. While we'll touch on it later, the training Bisky assigns for transmutation also implies that it is transmutation that is involved in changing the shape of one's aura, since her transmutation practice involves changing the shape of one's aura to form numbers. This makes sense since giving your aura a shape based on something like a number or object would be changing its qualities. Transmutation seems like one of the most misunderstood Nen types within the fanbase, along with Conjuration, and it's often mistaken for other types, so let's explain a bit here. One might assume that the ability to change the properties of one's aura would fall under manipulation, and using that category to control your aura or body. However, what manipulation entails is the infusion of your aura into an object or person in order to exert some level of control/influence over it, something that transmutation does not entail on its own. A lot of people also mistake transmutation for Conjuration, and even in-universe it's possible to mistake one for the other very easily unless you know what you're doing. Transmutation is simply changing the properties of one's Nen to give it one or more traits of something else. Additionally, because transmuted things are still raw aura, like most aura, they will rapidly dissipate if they're disconnected from the user's body, and the flow of aura it provides unless something like Emission is involved. This is different from Conjuration because objects created with Conjuration can still sometimes have object permanence, even if many of them still seem to weaken if given enough distance from the user. So if someone conjured a doll, put it on a table and ran a fair distance away, the dolls could potentially stay there even without Emission because the aura has become an actual physical object. But the dolls may become weaker or lose any special Nen abilities. This also means that non-users can by default see conjured objects unless someone is using N or otherwise hiding them, which makes Conjuration better for the physical disguises. Transmutation also allows for a level of flexibility and trickiness, since you can mix and match different properties to cause your aura to suddenly change, and don't need to make the objects wholesale. For example, Hisoka gives his aura the properties of rubber and gum. Not only that, but it seems like he can choose when and what parts are sticky, and it seems like he can make it suddenly more taut to pull himself around. But this could just be him using transmutation to mess with the aura shape and making it tighter or looser. Doug from the future here. I say Hisoka can control when his bungee gum is sticky because we see him use the bungee gum to bounce things back at a target, like Razor's dodgeball in chapter 168. But he has also just caught projectiles using the stickiness. Considering how sticky the gum can be, it's hard to imagine it's keeping the same level of adhesiveness while reflecting Razor's dodgeball or Goto's coins back at them at like full speed, the same speed that they were launched with. Especially since we know bungee gum is sticky enough to throw around entire bodies without coming loose. So what I'm saying here is that sometimes it seems like his bungee gum is sticky like gum, and sometimes it seems like it's not sticky like gum. It just morphs like gum and bounces like rubber. Conjuration is actually creating the substance or object in question, so you couldn't just give something the properties of rubber and gum, but actually be turned into rubber and gum, or just be coated in the stuff. To me, these differences can seem kind of nitpicky, but make it very clear that Togashi put some thought into this and its explanation, that I think people miss or don't look into. This will also be helpful when looking at transmutation abilities in the future, and analyzing some of the themes they seem to carry. I've also seen some people have misconceptions on what transmutation can even do. Some people seem to be under the impression that transmutation can be used to change the quality of something directly because of its name. However, transmutation is only about changing the properties of one's aura, and in fact, Conjuration and or manipulation seem to have more of a focus on changing existing physical objects in some way by either conjuring something in its place or exerting control over them. Some people then ask, then what is it you're transmuting? And while it's easy for one's mind to jump to alchemy or the like when hearing the term, the thing being transmuted is one's aura, as opposed to any physical object. Google defines transmutation as, quote, the action of changing or the state of being changed into another form, unquote. Feature Doug here. So even transmute itself is defined as a change in form, nature, or substance. Emphasis on the fact that it can be a change in nature and not always a physical thing. So even transmute itself is a word that is not specifically referred to physical objects and can refer to things like someone's nature. If you look here on the screen, I will have the definition as given by Google, and under that, the example they give is the raw material of his experience was transmuted into stories. So transmute, transmuted, transmutation, as words in the English lexicon, do not inherently just refer to physical objects. And in the context of Hunter x Hunter, I think specifically they are referring to transmuting your aura. It does not mean transmuting anything and everything. In the same way that emitters do not just emit whatever they want. Emitters do not just emit light. They are emitting their aura. It is a very specific thing they are referring to. So you are changing the state and or form of your aura, i.e. its properties and or shape, into something else. So Conjuration is actually closer to the quote-unquote alchemy Nen category than transmutation. And of course, manipulation would also be pretty close to what people think of when they think of the quote alchemy unquote Nen category, because manipulation allows you to influence physical materials or substances, objects, etc., and thus be able to rearrange them as needed. Transmuters have a 100% affinity for transmutation, obviously, 80% affinity for enhancement and conjuration, 60% affinity for emission, and 40% for manipulation, and 0% for specialization. Bisky's level 1 transmutation training is called shapeshifting, and in chapter 146 it involves the student running as they count from 0 to 9 by forming their aura into the shape of each subsequent number at the top of their index finger. If the student can form the numbers 0 through 9 for a total of 10 numbers within 1 minute, they can proceed to the next level of transmutation training. However, the end goal of this exercise is to actually be able to perform the practice in less than 5 seconds by rapidly forming the numbers. According to Hiso's personality test in chapter 62, chapter 63, and the omnibus I cannot verify, transmuters tend to be whimsical and prone to deceit. Something that they once treasured can be considered trash the next day, and they often have unique characteristics while often putting forth a facade to hide truer aspects of their personalities. Even when they aren't hiding their personalities, they are not prone to revealing their true intentions, and are often regarded as weirdos or tricksters. This whimsical, tricky, and unpredictable nature is often reflected in their Nen by often relying on techniques that give their Nen unique and unpredictable properties tied to their personalities. Like enhancers, transmuters have a soft and quiet tenor on the part of their body that activates their favorite attack or ability. To me, it's very obvious that with transmuters, there's a strong narrative of change. This makes sense, since while enhancers reinforce what is already there and conjurers create things, transmuters are changing aspects of their very life force directly by giving it new qualities. This change is also reflected in their general fickle personalities and deception, the ability to change how one presents themselves or acts, only to reveal it is a facade. This theme can also be seen in some of the character evolutions of transmuters. Killua's story is all about breaking away from his family and rejecting the lifestyle of an assassin that his family has been trying to force him to take on since birth. And Yuppie is noted as being very instinctive, but during his battle with Knuckle and Co., he is noted as becoming more mindful and thoughtful, being able to direct his rage better with an actual goal in mind. There's even Bisky, who desperately wished to change her body and over time got a smaller, quote-unquote, cuter form she could switch to avoid her body's dysphoria, and even hide her true power and strength. Although we don't know what Nen type is involved in Bisky's transformation, and I doubt it's simply transmutation by virtue of the fact that everyone can see the change, including non-users. But she herself is still transmuter. Finally, there's Hisoka, who's,
I just can't wait.
That, I guess. The nature of transmutation is also revealed in the water divination test itself. While categories like enhancement and conjuration create clear visible changes in the water that anyone can see, when a transmuter performs the test, the water looks unchanged. It is only the taste that has changed. So at first glance, it looks like nothing happens to water. This shows how transmutation cannot automatically be seen by non-users. The change only occurs to one's aura/life force as opposed to automatically being a physical one, like conjuration or enhancement. Not to mention, this can be one of the more subtle changes, since at first glance, it may look like nothing has changed at all, or that the test taker has failed. But this is a facade with an unseen change occurring. The fact that the 10 of transmuters tends to be quiet and soft around the part of the body that activates their favorite ability is probably meant to reflect the part of the aura they transmute the most based on its location around the body. Conjuration. We already touched on conjuration a little bit, but now we'll have a dedicated look at it. It can often be mistaken for transmutation, even in universe. So while I will bring up the differences, I'll try not to harp on all of them here since I already went into detail for some of them within the last section. The first most obvious difference between conjuration and transmutation is the effects they create in the water divination test. When a transmuter performs a test, the water doesn't change physically, even though the flavor does. But with conjurers, there is a tangible, physical, visible change in the water as impurities form within it, a reflection of how transmutation is used to change the qualities and or shape of one's aura, but conjuration is used to form actual objects and substances. Conjuration, of course, allows for the creation of physical objects and materials out of one's aura, and there are plenty of examples of this being done within the series, such as Kurapika conjuring chains. However, it is clear that conjuration can also be used to manifest something in place of or alter existing physical objects. For example, in chapter 391, the character Padella, I've never actually had to pronounce that name out loud, so I have no idea how to pronounce his name. He is a conjurer who is granted the ability Fistful of Weapons, I'm Coming to Get You, by Mora's Contagion. Said ability allows him to turn his right hand into a variety of tools, such as a hammer and drill. Heimer Big and Duffno. can use Conjuration in the form of visibility biohazard, set in the palm of your hand to turn inanimate objects such as cameras, guns, and handcuffs into animals. These constructs even seem to have the functions of the object they originally were. For example, in chapter 391, Heinrich turns a camera into a cat, but the cat seems capable of recording like a camera in regards to what it sees for when it's turned back into its original form. The ability to change physical real objects would probably also explain part of the reason Kurapika's chains seem to change length when he slings them around sometimes. He's probably using Conjuration to make more chain links or extend the length, and in chapter 77, Kurapika even makes one of his already conjured chains bigger. If Conjuration couldn't directly affect existing objects, then it's more likely that Kurapika would have to dispel the chains and materialize them again, but he doesn't. So we know that you can at least change existing conjured objects via Conjuration. This might also explain how Owl's conjured Fun Claw shrinks things that are caught within it. Hey, it's me, Doug, from the future, to add an extra note to my argument, because I actually have more points I can make that point to transforming yourself or other objects as being a Conjuration thing, and not a Transmutation thing. First off, it's important to remember that Transmutation is changing your aura property specifically, which means a non-user cannot see it. This alone severely limits what kind of transmogrification or disguise type stuff Transmutation alone can perform, since, while Conjuration can be made visible or invisible, something that is transmuted cannot be made visible directly. This is not to say that Transmutation cannot have visible effects. For example, Killua's aura can cause hair to stand up when given the properties of electricity due to mimicking the static, and I'm sure that if you transmuted your aura into being as hot as fire, it would visibly burn things. But Conjuration can be used to create actual physical mass that is visible to everyone. If it was solely Transmutation being used in order to do something like transform your appearance, or turn into something else, then there's a pretty good chance that non-users would not see it, or it would look way different to them, which is more likely to be mentioned and much less likely to be a good disguise. Additionally, all users we have seen with abilities that transform themselves into vehicles are actually conjurers, not transmuters. According to Togashi's exhibition puzzle, the Zoldyck butler, Tsubone, is actually a conjurer that sits next to Kite. Now, she does have a lean towards transmutation, so I'll give people that. There's also the side character Kurtan during the Succession War. While this character has very little screen time, Bill confirms two things about this character in chapter 361. First, he is a conjurer, and his second ability is quite similar to Tsubone's Rider's High, in that it allows him to transform into at least one vehicle. In this case, a boat that can carry up to 5 people, that is then fueled by their aura. The aura of the people riding the boat, that is to say. Now, someone could argue that even though all the characters I mentioned are conjurers, that doesn't necessarily mean they're using Conjuration, or only Conjuration. But I think the reasoning only goes so far when we have characters like Heinrich, who can turn a camera into a full-on cat, and basically every single character we've seen with this flavor of Transmutation is a conjurer. So if you think all this transforming stuff is strictly Transmutation, you'd have to argue that basically none of these conjurers are using Conjuration at all, which is way different than a one-off character not using the Nen type they have an affinity for. Some people might try to argue that Hisoka is proof a transmuter can directly change their body, since after his fight with Chrollo in chapter 357, it recreates destroyed parts of his body with bungee gum. However, this would be a misunderstanding of what Hisoka is doing if you argue it proves Transmutation can alter physical objects directly. Firstly, Hisoka is not altering his flesh to create new parts or shaping existing flesh. He's shaping his bungee gum into what is basically an aura adhesive to stop the bleeding, along with an aura prosthetic that he can control while it is attached to his body, but not directly transforming his body. Secondly, in order to give the illusion his body is whole, he is actually using the Conjuration ability Texture Surprise to give the appearance of skin and or flesh. Texture Surprise is also stated to only work on thin flat surfaces, at least before Hisoka died, and we have seen it used on things like napkins and paper, making it yet another example of Conjuration altering a physical object if we use chapter 55 as reference. If he was only using Transmutation for this feat, to Nen users, Hisoka would look like a corpse with some bubblegum stuck onto it. And to non-users, he would stick out like a sore thumb, because he would be a corpse that is somehow walking around and grabbing things, even with the hand that has no fingers. What's probably allowing Hisoka to move these transmuted body parts is the fact that Transmutation can be used to control and shape aura, as we mentioned previously. More specifically, Hisoka has demonstrated the ability to make bungee gum contract, and how our muscles allow us to move is a complicated process of contracting and relaxing. So even if you want to use this scene as a case for Transmutation being able to transmute anything, not just aura, Hisoka is still using Conjuration. So at best, in order to transform physical objects, you still can't solely use Transmutation. Even then, I think there are enough examples of conjurers we know or can presume are using Conjuration to transform objects. So it's certainly possible to do it with just Conjuration, while it seems impossible to do it with just Transmutation directly. The only possible concrete argument I can think of to potentially dispute this is Bisky and her ability to alter her form because she's a transmuter. However, we don't have an actual confirmation of what Nen type she's using in chapter 375. She says even she herself has no idea how it works, but she acquired it over time little by little. So the use of Conjuration for this ability isn't actually ruled out, and while it could be Specialization or even Manipulation, I've already given plenty examples of Conjuration being used to alter bodies in appearance and or shape. Additionally, while Bisky is a transmuter, transmutation is in fact right next to Conjuration on the Nen chart, meaning it's not too much of a stretch that if a transmuter like Hisoka can use the category to great effect, then someone like Bisky could too, even if potentially unconsciously. Now, I'm sure you could do some extreme transformation by using Conjuration to change your body and transmutation to change your aura, but I just don't think this is a requirement for literally every transformation. In chapter 374, Kurapika explains that conjurers can also excel at creating laws and rules and affixing them to an area. This might sound confusing at first, since exerting control over something or someone else sounds like it would be under the domain of manipulation. But it appears that rules and laws made with Conjuration don't involve infusing aura into a target like manipulation would. We also get an example of what Kurapika is talking about in regards to Conjuration and law enforcement with the character Yokotani in chapter 399. Morona's contagion granted him the Conjuration ability A Battle of Wits, LSDF, and narration explains it is a, quote, a defensive ability only usable in the hideout when Morona is present. It activates when Yokotani introduces himself to unlawful intruders. The conjured guards cannot harm the target, but the target's attacks also have no effect, unquote. When Yokotani sends these soldiers to attack, they say, caution level 4, 2 targets charged with breaking and entering, and attempted murder, before Yokotani has them carry out a sentence of eviction to throw Nobunaga and Heinrich out of the hideout. So it would appear that the ability can be activated in response to someone breaking the law when entering the hideout. It's also not outside the realm of possibility that a conjurer could, say, create a room and give the room certain conditions or situations it can react to. Another example of what Kurapika could be referring to would be an ability like Chitu's, which can conjure an entire landscape that the people inside cannot leave until they finish a game of tag in chapter 245. Chitu is also a good example of Conjuration being used to create entire landscapes that are cut off from the outside world, also seen in chapter 245. The Hunter x Hunter Phantom Wiki claims that Conjuration can also be used to create pocket dimensions, but I'm not 100% sure if that tracks. It's possible they are arguing that Owl's Cloth or Chitu's tag game utilize some sort of pocket dimension, but I can't find anything confirming that. They are probably referring to Na's Hide and Seek, which involves using a Nen space, and while I personally wouldn't be surprised if the physical rooms are created via Conjuration, especially since it doesn't appear to be a normal building and is described as an artificial Nen dimension / space in chapter 246, so we know it is an artificially created space of some sort and not merely just an existing building that people are being teleported to and from. So my personal guess is that Nob is conjuring a simple set of rooms and uses a mission to teleport people to and from it. This lines up with how, in chapter 374, Kurapika also explains that the ability to isolate and completely cut off spaces is a specialty of emitters and conjurers. This could be the thing that the wiki is referring to, and to me, it reinforces the idea that Nob is probably using a combination of Emission and Conjuration for his hide and seek. Conjurations create a physical room with a mission to act as a way to bring people in and or out with a mission, and or Conjuration being used to cut off the space from the outside world. And it's not like the idea of emitters making use of Conjuration, despite it being opposite of Emission on the chart, is a foreign concept. For example, in chapter 347, Ging seems to identify the gun-wielding attackers as emitters that are using conjured guns to unleash a barrage of projectiles, and says even though they're emitters, they're the type that would conjure guns, implying that it is possible but not recommended, even if we later learn that their weapons are actually conjured by Golem and not the wielders themselves. According to Nobunaga in chapter 398, while conjurers can create special areas with specific rules, teleportation leans too much into Emission. So Emission is definitely more of the teleport category, even if both Conjuration and Emission have ways of sealing off areas. In the first and second version of this article, I claimed that a page on chapter 82 stated that it was manipulators that can pour the most aura into an object, but after embarrassing myself on Reddit, someone explained to me that this was a typo / mistranslation in the reference I was using, and in both the anime and manga during Uvagen's battle with Kurapika, he says only a manipulator or conjurer could pour so much aura into an object, implying that both conjurers and manipulators can pour the most aura into objects, which makes sense in both cases because we know manipulation involves infusing aura into a physical object, and conjured objects are those literally made out of physical aura. Not to mention that conjurers can literally change physical objects from one thing into another. Either way, guess who's going to need to read through 100 pages of writing for like a third or fourth time at this point, while checking the translations of some of the pages used as reference. Never say I don't care about accuracy or that I don't do anything for you. The affinity spread for conjurers is a 100% in Conjuration, 80% in Transmutation, 0% in Specialization, 60% in Enhancement and Manipulation, and 40% in Emission. Unlike Transmutation, Conjuration abilities seem to be capable of having a level of object permanence to them that raw aura does not, and they can be seen by non-users because they are physical objects. However, this isn't always true. It doesn't seem to render Emission redundant. Some Conjuration abilities may require the user to be within a certain distance, or supply aura as a sort of restriction, and it is possible to render conjured objects invisible with techniques like In, and potentially certain abilities / conditions, such as when Kurapika hides his conjured chains within in chapter 82. In chapter 108, Kurapika states that while his chains are conjured, he does use manipulation and Emission with Judgment Chain as a way to enforce a condition onto the target that must be followed, and control the blade involved from a distance. He also states that normally, this would be impossible for him to do since removing the chain from its fasting point would cause it to lose all its energy and force. This could imply that every instance we see of a conjured object being separated from the user actually involves emission in the Hatsu. But then you have cases like Yukatani in chapter 399. Yukatani is another character who was granted an ability by Mortis Contagion, and it's stated by the narration to just be a Conjuration ability. Despite this, Yukatani's LCF seems to be able to chase Nobunaga at a decent distance. Additionally, it seems like Kurtopi can create copies of an object without emission, but this isn't directly stated, so I might be wrong. It's possible that what allows Yukatani's LSDF to persist is the limitation that can only be used in certain areas while Moran is present in said area, because it's within range of some N-style aura effect. I would be surprised if that was the case because of how this Nen is portrayed, or because of how the summons are conjured and function. They might be something akin to actual robots, people, Nen beasts, etc. that can keep operating without Yukatani being directly within arm's reach. My personal reading is that some conjuration abilities dissipate if they are too far from the user, but others can persist due to being actual objects. However, without something like Emission, if they are too far, they may literally just act like the normal objects they are, or lose any special Nen abilities, because some may need aura as fuel to do whatever it is they need to do. Additionally, categories like Emission and Manipulation allow you to directly control and influence these physical aura constructs from a distance. However, even in these cases, Conjuration still involves creating actual objects or substances in their entirety, and not just picking and choosing traits like you might with Transmutation. This makes Conjuration a bit limited in some respects, since you have to be more considerate of things like physics, even if there are clever ways to circumvent it. This also tends to make conjurers more reliant on things like conditions, limitations, and vows to set their Nen constructs apart from just normal everyday objects by strengthening them or giving them strange Nen properties. According to Izunabi in chapter 83, it's impossible to make something that is, quote, overly supernatural, unquote, with Conjuration, and you cannot make something like a sword that can cut through anything and everything. Kurapika puts it another way when he correctly answers Izunabi's question by saying one cannot make things that go beyond the human abilities, such as the sword that can cut through anything I just mentioned. Such an object couldn't be conjured. It's in this explanation that we can see why conjurers tend to be more thoughtful. A good conjurer kind of has to be, and your items have to be considered carefully. Kurapika and Izunabi confirm that while you can't summon a sword that cuts through anything, you could summon an extremely sharp and durable sword. However, if that is literally all it has going for it, you might as well just buy yourself a good saber and reinforce it with aura, even if you couldn't make it disappear and reappear like a normal Nen construct for convenience, as explained in chapter 83. As Izunabi says, quote, in short, conjuring already existing objects doesn't always make an effective weapon. In other words, it's difficult to make things better than God did. The users of Conjuration have in their hands a force that is basically difficult to master in fights. Unquote. Izunabi tells Kurapika that while he can't make an unbreakable chain with Conjuration, something close to it is possible with the right conditions and limitations. We see Kurapika achieve this by putting conditions and limitations on his chain jail to make it strong enough to bind even the physically strongest Phantom Troop member, the Enhancer Uvoken. This does also tell us that conjurers can obviously make more supernatural creations if done correctly. We have seen people conjure Nen beasts or entities that seemingly otherwise don't already exist in the world of Hunter x Hunter, as far as we know anyway. Like Kite's Crazy Slot's clown or Abangane's weird exorcism creature. And we have seen weird things like Shizuku's Blinky, which takes the form of a vacuum Nen beast that can inhale a seemingly infinite number of inanimate objects at the cost of not being able to inhale living things or things made with Nen. Plus, Blinky can only spit up the very last thing it inhaled, and Shizuku can't bring anything else back. Where all the items inhaled by Blinky go is unknown, so it's not clear if they're being turned into something else, teleported somewhere else, taken to some conjured space, digested, or what. When giving a heads up about Yokotani's LSDF in chapter 406, Nobunaga describes it as a counteractive type ability in which attacking it triggers some sort of invincibility switch and level up. I'm not sure if this would confirm that a construct like LSDF is literally invincible, because it could just be absurdly durable and strong, like Kurapika's chains, and it's possible that it's just really hard to destroy. Alternatively, more likely given how the narration explains ability, what allows for its indestructibility could be that it can't hurt its targets as a trade-off, so it cannot hurt its targets in any way and vice versa. So the target has their form of indestructibility from LSDF itself, and the ability cannot hurt them. Feature Doug here. This actually isn't the first time we've gotten indestructible Nen constructs. In chapter 211, Knuckles says that attacking APR/pot clean directly is useless because it is invincible. However, it cannot harm the person it is attached to directly. So it would seem that it is in fact possible to create indestructible constructs with the right restrictions. However, the trade-off always seems to be that these constructs cannot directly harm people, and pot clean works from Knuckle actually giving his opponent some of his aura as a loan, which acts as a trade-off. So you can make indestructible constructs, but not a sword that can cut through anything. Also, in both cases of Knuckles' APR and Yokotani's LSDF, they are temporary constructs that do not exist perpetually. They do whatever their job is and then disappear. Not to mention they all have abilities that only actually harm you upon breaking an established rule of some kind. I also doubt you could make indestructible full body armor with no weaknesses, since in both the cases of Knuckle and Yokotani, you can attack the user directly or before they activate the ability. Kortopi's own ability, Gallery Fake, allows him to conjure replicas of an object from his right hand as long as he touches it with his left. In chapter 103, it is stated that these replicas will always disappear after 24 hours pass, no matter the size. We have no concrete size limit for what can be copied, and Kortopi has copied multiple full-size buildings, although I have to imagine creating bigger objects requires more aura. In chapter 108, Kortopi says his copies are like a form of N, allowing him to detect if someone entered one of his copied buildings. But I can't be 100% sure that this doesn't somehow involve other types of Nens, such as Emission, or only works on things in range of his aura. I think all this together tells us that it's useful to think of conjured objects like an extension of one's Nen/aura, and you could use this to your advantage to give them supernatural properties. The most obvious example would be being able to make your conjured objects appear and disappear, since the objects are made of aura given physical form, and aura is normally invisible and not just a physical object. It makes sense that you may be able to return a conjured object into the aura it is made out of. Like all forms of Nen/aura, conjured objects can be affected by vows and restrictions, or can act as extensions of other techniques, such as N, and N can be used to hide conjured creations like any other flow of aura. Conjuration can be used to physically transform one or more parts of your own body or other objects, but Nolnop is presumably using conjuration in the form of his metamorphosis ability to change his appearance in chapter 405, since anyone and everyone can see the change, even non-users on the Black Whale. And going back to what I said earlier about conjuration being like an extension of someone's aura, we have also seen conjured objects pass through solid objects, which seems a little weird at first. Like for example, Kurapika's chains can pass through Ubogen's body and to wrap around his heart, which seems a little weird at first, but then if you consider the fact that normally aura is not always a physical thing and can sometimes pass through physical objects, it makes more sense. Conjuration can be combined with other Nen types for different effects, such as the healing chain Kurapika made by including Enhancement that was shown off in chapter 84. Although using it while his eyes were scarlet is probably why its healing was so effective, like with Judgment Chain's effectiveness. Unlike some of the other Nen types, we don't get to see Biscuit's conjuration training. We do get some details of the conjuration training Kurapika had to go through under Izunabi in chapter 123. In Kurapika's case, it involved deciding on the object he wanted to conjure, a chain in this case, before spending a bunch of time with the real chains day and night. He then began to close his eyes and visualize the chains, made sketches of the chains, touched the chains, caressed the chains, and committed them to his five senses before he started having dreams of chains, and then getting full-on hallucinations and subconsciously summoning a chain. This also potentially involves understanding how it tastes, since Kurapika mentions coming with the object to all five basic senses. And I've seen people assume that this means you have to know how something tastes in order to conjure it, but I think the actual point of the training is that in order to conjure an object, you typically need to have an incredibly good understanding of what it is, what it's made of, and how it works, unless you're some kind of Nen genius that can intuit how to make these things on the fly, have some specific ability, or proper restriction. The conjured things in question usually have to be something that can actually function, which relates to Izunabi's comment about being unable to conjure overly supernatural things. Transmuting a car would just involve shaping your aura into a car and making it roll like one. But if you wanted to conjure an entire car, the car in question usually has to be able to actually run properly and have the necessary working pieces, unless you compensate properly with the inclusion of some other Nen type, limitations, vows, restrictions, etc. being applied correctly. According to Hiso's personality test, conjurers tend to be overly serious, stoic, and nervous. They are very observant and logical, rarely falling into traps. Being able to analyze things calmly is the strength of conjurers. Many of the items that conjurers create are often used by them deliberately, practically, and logically. Hopefully you can see how this might actually make a lot of sense considering the nature of conjuration. It takes a lot of consideration and thought to make a conjuration ability that is practical and functional. Conjurers have a stronger tenor around the body part that activates their favorite abilities, but a gentler flow of aura everywhere else, probably correlating to the part of the body and aura they use to create their conjured object. The fact that conjurers typically want to keep their dominant hand free is most likely because they conjure physical things they can/need to interact with or wield for their abilities. If we look at conjuration from a more thematic perspective, we can see an obvious theme on physicality. When a conjurer does the water divination test, impurities form within the water, creating substances/objects like conjuration abilities tend to do, something that can be physically seen in the water. Conjuration also seems to have a theme of paying close attention to detail. Once again, this makes sense since conjurers are actually creating objects and need to be mindful of that. Conjurers also usually need to have a really good understanding of how even simple objects work and behave, as we see with Kurapika's training. So there's this thread of understanding physical aspects of the world and sometimes even understanding how to change them with a sort of groundedness and thoughtful reasoning. Conjuration abilities also seem like they are usually more complex in function than most enhancer abilities, which usually lean towards more simplistic. Specialization. I'm actually going to skip over specialization even though I said I would tackle the Nen chart in clockwise direction. The reason for this is because a massive part what specialization is comes down to understanding what the other categories are not. So we'll circle back to specialization after we cover the remaining 9 categories, which you would know if you were paying attention to me, unlike my cold-hearted and distant lover, the Green Island Pirate NPC. Manipulation. In chapter 61, we are told that if the leaf floating in the water moves upon someone taking the water divination test, they are a manipulator. Winnie explains in chapter 60 that manipulation can be used to manipulate both living and non-living things with aura. This control seems to be exerted by a user infusing their aura into a target, since in chapter 82, Ubogen says that manipulators and conjurers can pour the most aura into an object. In the original version of this article, due to a mistranslation/typo, I mistakenly state that solely manipulators pour the most aura into an object, but that is actually implied not to be the case. And in chapter 388, Babaminya says that if Kurapika was using manipulation to force the nodes of other people open, either partially or fully, his aura would be mixed with theirs. This, of course, means manipulators are usually reliant on some sort of physical medium or object to control, such as Kyuto Zoldik's paper, or exert control over other things, like how Illumi controls people with his needles. It can actually sometimes be quite hard to detect if something is under the effects of manipulation. Killua had a needle from Illumi in his head, exerting some control over him for years without really anybody seeming to notice, or at least mention it from what I can recall. And in chapter 388, Furikov states he cannot tell if Kurapika is using any sort of manipulation to awaken the nodes of his class with only one person as reference. He had to see multiple people to reach a 100% certain conclusion. Not all applications of manipulation are created equal, since how much control one has over a target or medium can depend on various factors, such as the limitations, conditions, etc. of the ability in question. It is also known that the stronger of an emotional connection one has to an object, the better it works as a medium. In chapter 50, Wing says that part of the reason Gudo controls tops so well is probably because he has a strong connection to his tops. I know Gudo is an enhancer, but Wing confirms that Gudo is also applying a form of manipulation in chapter 60 to exert some level of influence over the tops and aid in their spinning. So things someone has a strong emotional connection towards tend to work better as a medium or conduit for manipulation, as opposed to random objects. In chapter 106, Shonak also knows that manipulators still need to develop and master whatever it is they are manipulating, or using to manipulate other things, or else there is a high chance it will lack power and accuracy. There are also some general rules that we know all manipulators, no matter the skill level, tend to be restricted by. There's the first come first serve rule as explained in chapter 226. Manipulation cannot be used to control a target that is already under the effects of another user's manipulation, presumably no matter how powerful and or skilled either of them are. Also, generally, the greater the control one can exert over something with manipulation, the more restrictions they need. The more difficult / restricted the condition / limitation is, the greater control afforded. This can range anywhere from a specific limit on how many targets you can manipulate, to what is an eligible target, to even something like having to make physical contact with a target, or just having to pour more aura into something. Some examples of restrictions would be Illumi having to stick his needles into the people he wants to manipulate. Gudo can only control his tops, Morel manipulating the smoke he makes with his pipe, Shonak having his black voice tied to his phone and antenna, the latter of which must be stuck into a target, etc. In-universe manipulators can be quite scared to face in combat, because if you don't know what their abilities are, and their restrictions are, there's actually always a chance they could have something that can control you directly once one or more conditions are met. Meaning unknown or unaccounted for manipulators could have a potential one-shot. For example, if Shonak gets someone with his black voice, or Illumi with his needles, they would just have to make the person kill themselves, run around till they die, sit still as they attack them, etc. Illumi's ability in particular permanently cripples the manipulated target. An example of how dangerous a manipulator's ability can be at play would be during Krollo's and Hisoka's fight in chapter 351. In chapter 50, Wing also explains that the type of object being manipulated matters too. Complex objects and living beings can be given much more complex and nuanced auras than something more simplistic like a spinning top. In the same chapter, Wing also confirms that the size of an object matters too. The bigger an object, the more auras need to manipulate it. Kind of like how you need more electricity to power bigger machines and devices. Kurapika also confirms in chapter 372 that messing with someone's memories can be done with manipulation, and is often a symptom of a manipulator's attack. In chapter 372, 374, and 381, most of it is explained in 372, we get some details regarding different types of manipulation abilities. Although I should clarify that it doesn't seem like one has a natural affinity for any of these manipulation categories or anything, so I don't think it's some kind of miniature Nen chart within the larger one. Instead, it is probably merely just meant to group together common traits or conditions manipulation abilities have. So listing abilities involve leaving the free will of a victim intact, but forcing them to operate under a condition that works in the favor of the one doing the manipulating. An example of this given would be rewriting someone's memories while leaving their free will intact, so they are operating with incomplete information or can be tricked into doing something. This type of manipulation can be used to influence several targets while also consuming a small amount of aura. Of course, the trade-off is how much control you actually have over the target, since you aren't full on robbing them of their free will. Coercive abilities are simply ones that involve completely taking over the victim's mind and body to exert total control. But it's obviously more limited in how many targets you can control at once, since we know it requires more aura to pull this off. Pseudo-coercive abilities are ones that take over the body of a target while leaving their mind intact or force them into a situation in which they have no choice but to follow the manipulator's orders. Momose's Garden's Spirit Beast is a good example of this. The Nen Beast in question will show up near a target and continuously ask them if they are free. If the target says no, they will eventually have to deal with this process repeating over and over until they agree. Once this happens, the Nen Beast will take control of the host. So basically, while coercive involves your mind and body being puppeted, pseudo-coercive abilities give the illusion of choice, or just railroad someone into following the manipulator's commands by controlling their body, but not the mind or memories. I imagine the downside is that the target is more likely to be able to warn other people of what happened during or after the ability goes off, because their perception and memories aren't being messed with as much. If you control someone's mind or alter their memories, there is less of a chance that they even know what happened, or can warn others and share information. Induction type is apparently what Zoi Zoi's Nen Beast makes use of, as mentioned in chapter 374. It's not directly explained what this entails, but we can make some assumptions based on what we see of Solly's Nen beast. Rihan goes over how the beast uses diffusive induction to spread its influence, and while the level of control it has over its victims is weak, it can manipulate a great number of people. We also know that what Solly's Nen beast does is produce smoke that when inhaled for long enough will turn someone into a carrier with a miniature version of the Nen beast above their head, and will harbor good favor towards the respective khaki prince. So I assume that the diffusion induction type doesn't completely rob someone of free will, like coercive, but pushes certain emotions or opinions in a certain direction. The fact that it doesn't grant complete control over a target and their actions is probably why it can influence so many people. Maybe it controls a particular target emotion or opinion to get you to like something more or less, but not the mind entirely. I cannot be 100% certain though, and this is just my educated guess. Rihan specifically says that Solly's beast uses induction through diffusion, so I imagine the diffusion part is how it spreads from person to person and multiplies. According to Google, the definition of diffusion is, quote, the spreading of something more widely, unquote. And induction means, quote, the action or process of inducting someone to a position or organization, unquote. So it's possible that diffusive manipulation abilities are those that spread across multiple targets, like a disease, and inductive ones are those that try to form some sort of group or following. Induction can also mean quote, the process or action of bringing about or giving rise to something, unquote, which takes us back to the original theory of the abilities that target specific emotions or opinions. In this case, inducing them would be giving rise to them or increasing them. Future Doug here once again. I spent a lot of time in the last note going over how Conjuration can be used to create disguises or physical objects. But with that said, manipulation has some ways of doing that too. For example, Illumi can modify his appearance with his needles by what we assume uses manipulation both with and without his needles. I refer to Conjuration as a category that can allow for the Full Metal Alchemist type alchemy that can transform existing objects and/or materials, but it goes without saying that manipulation can be used to exert control over objects, and it would by extension probably allow you to do some, quote, alchemy, unquote, by controlling the components of an object or substance. It's also important to consider that even different Nen types can excel at the same things, albeit in different ways, and sometimes with different limitations. For example, as mentioned previously, Kurapika says Conjuration and Emission both excel at isolating and cutting off areas, but characters like Nobunaga tell us that teleportation is an Emission thing. Anyway, I suppose a character like Bisky and Bonolanov could be using a form of manipulation to alter their bodies. I mentioned Bonolanov being a conjurer, but apparently that's from a Hunter x Hunter data book, and so many of those have been inaccurate in the past, so take that info with a grain of salt. However, in the case of Bonolanov, he also suddenly gains clothes he did not have before when disguising himself. In the case of Illumi, we don't see him transform into Hisoka, so it's possible he used manipulation to change his face, and then you just receive some clothes from Hisoka. But with Bonolanov, it's hard to imagine that purely manipulation is being used to create a new set of clothes for the disguise. Especially when just conjuring the clothes is something that would make the most sense with a few hoops to jump through, no matter Bonolanov's Nen type. And who's to say that even in the case of Illumi, just pure manipulation is being used either. Manipulators have 100% affinity for manipulation, 0% for specialization, 80% for emission, 60% for conjuration and enhancement, with a 40% affinity for transmutation. One question I've been seeing floating around a bit is what the difference between manipulation and emission actually is. This is a fair question since manipulation abilities can seemingly also have a lot of range by virtue of imbuing something with aura to carry out orders from a decent enough range, even without emission. Gudo doesn't need to use emission for his tops, for example. It's possible to have a manipulation ability that allows you to actively give orders with things like a device or your voice. The difference is pretty simple though. Manipulation is infusing one's aura into a target, while emission is just separating aura from your body. With emission, you aren't putting the aura into any object. This also means that manipulators usually need some sort of medium to use in the form of something like an object or substance, while emitters won't as often have this requirement. I guess I would put it this way. Manipulation is being able to sort of store aura within an object, like a battery to control it, and emission is just separating it like a projectile or enveloping something. Emission also includes abilities like teleporting. So if you see someone just lob a bunch of aura at someone, that's emission. But if someone is, say, controlling a physical doll, that is manipulation. Of course, you can also mix these things by doing things like emitting a projectile that once it makes contact with the target grants you control over it. Unfortunately, despite all the info we have on manipulation in the form of its classifications, we haven't yet seen any training regimens for it yet, Bisky or otherwise. Hiso's personality test describes most manipulators as argumentative and logical people that advance at their own pace. They usually want to keep those who they care about safe, but may not listen to what others have to say about it when it comes to their own goal. While enhancers tend to have simple techniques, manipulators often make use of techniques that allow them to control their opponent, such as Illumi's needles, or something inanimate, such as Morel's smoke. Unrelated to the personality test, we have even seen manipulators control their own bodies. In chapter 227, Shalnark sticks one of his needles into himself in order to enter some sort of autopilot mode. So if anyone was wondering, yes, it seems you can use manipulation on your own body. It's also important to point out that manipulation doesn't have to grant complete control over a target. Sometimes it takes the form of basic commands or reactions something is following, as opposed to 100% conscious control all the time. Manipulators usually having a broader tent that turns darker if they attempt to shrink it probably relates to how both manipulators and emitters tend to have a bit more range to their techniques, and often have more external range for their aura. In the case of emitters, it comes from the ability to separate their aura from their body, but for manipulators it comes from being able to infuse their aura into a target. It could also be that their aura is sort of stretched from using it to manipulate things that meet a certain condition or range. The tendency to keep the hand they use for their ability free probably has to do with most manipulators requiring something like a physical medium for their abilities, and your hands are probably something you will use to interact with said medium. To me, the overarching themes manipulators tend to have is less clear than some of the other Nen categories, but there's definitely an emphasis on control, which makes sense because manipulation is all about infusing your aura into something as a way to exert control over it. The fact that they advance at their own pace, want to keep loved ones safe, but don't listen to what said loved ones have to say when it comes to their own goals, potentially lends itself to someone who is controlling and does what they think is best for the people around them, like a Lumi. When they take the water divination test, the leaf in the water moves, which doesn't sound like the most mind-blowing result because you could achieve the same effect by just blowing on the leaf a bit, even if it is an on-the-nose way of showing that manipulation is about controlling things, such as the leaf in the water. Their propensity to be argumentative and logical could also relate to a desire to control things around them, or even control their own emotions. There's a push to have everything calculated and under control. You could also read manipulators following the beat of their own drum as a sort of resistance to being limited by or controlled by outside forces, ironically enough. All of this could be reflected in how their abilities also often involve controlling other people / things. The first come, first serve rule that prevents another manipulator from overriding control of a target someone is already influencing, and in a way these could be seen as making things advance at the manipulator's own pace for whatever purpose. Emission. If you take the divination test and you find that the color of the water has changed, then you are an emitter. Emission can be used to separate one's aura from their body, and as an emitter, you have a way easier time separating your aura from your body than other Nen users, and can do it for much longer. Obviously, this means techniques including emission involve separating one's aura from their body, and thus tend to have a lot of range, long-lasting effects, remote effects, or abilities that can be activated remotely since they can function a fair distance away from the user themselves, while still being influenced by them. Which is actually pretty neat because generally aura falls in intensity very quickly the second it is disconnected from the body. But emitters can maintain separated aura for much longer periods of time, while also maintaining various functions and applications. I should note that emission is specifically detaching aura from one's body, not just stretching or shaping it. So something like N wouldn't involve emission because you are not actually separating any aura from your body. Emission can also be combined with other Nen types to allow aura to persist away from the user for a lot longer and create more ranged abilities. We have seen emission used for a variety of purposes. The easiest to understand and most commonly seen by the audience is probably simple aura-based projectiles, be they destructive balls of aura like Razor's weird Nen balls, Franklin's double machine gun, or a blast like Gon's Jajonkin paper, and Bisky's emission training. However, like with all Nen types, reducing the emission to just the projectile Nen type that lets you shoot Kamehamehas and spirit guns is a very surface level reading. Liurio and Jing have used emission to extend the range of their attacks by allowing the aura to sort of transfer their blows to a more distant target. There's also people like Nob, Luini, and Volcante who all use forms of emission to teleport various things, while Terrabellum can use his damage, Sweet Home, to transfer damage to himself or other things. Touching things with his right hand as said thing is being attacked will cause damage to transfer to him, and if he's touching something with his left hand as he's attacked, the damage will transfer to said target, as seen in chapter 399. This is also an interesting example of seemingly more short-range emission abilities. In chapter 374, Kurapika states that Emission and Conjuration both excel at isolating and completely cutting off spaces. This is probably because conjurers can physically change the space or create a new one, while emitters can utilize teleportation to move people or potentially the space itself, making it impossible to enter normally. According to Nobunaga in chapter 398, while conjurers can create special areas with specific rules, teleportation leans too much into emission. In chapter 379, Fink states that spatial teleportation abilities require something called marking, a term that refers to how a Nen user cannot teleport to somewhere they've never actually visited. I assume this condition exists because emission is about separating aura from your body, but it still has limits to how far you can just lob raw aura. Thus, you need a way to get your aura into a certain area as a sort of waypoint or target. It might also have to do with how the mind works, and Nen locates areas as well as just bouncing for the story. We have also seen emission abilities that are capable of passing through solid objects as a way to sense information or just allow an ability to pass through it for the sake of an attack or reaching something within it or on the other side, such as with the technique Ging performs in 347. In the same chapter, Jing separates the aura from his body in a wave-like shape in order to detect things like an ultrasound. I imagine emission can be quite useful for detection, since you can separate it to use it as a detached, more distant form of N, or as a way to sense things your aura makes contact with as it disconnects from your body. Emitting aura also seems like it sometimes potentially leaves the user with less aura from themselves to draw on, as long as it is away from their body. The clearest example for this would be Razor getting a massive boost in aura and power after reabsorbing his 14 devils in chapter 166. While this could be a quirk or limitation of Razor's specific Nen ability, I think the assumption that separating a significant enough amount of aura from yourself for long periods of time leaves you with less aura to use does actually make intuitive sense as an assumption for some abilities. Emitters have a 100% affinity for Emission, 80% affinity for Manipulation and Enhancement, 60% affinity for Transmutation, 0% for Specialization, and a 40% for Conjuration. Bisky's level 1 emission training, as seen in chapter 148, involves a practitioner forming a small bubble at the tip of their index finger and maintaining it. Once they manage to do this for 1 minute, they must attempt to throw the bubble without having it dissipate before it reaches a certain target, such as a rock. Bisky states that how long the aura bubble can stay afloat is tied to the user's proficiency with 10. Bisky's level 5 version of emission training is called Floating Hand, or something like Float Palm depending on the translation. It is introduced as a level 2 training exercise, but Bisky reveals to Killua it's actually a level 5 exercise. In chapter 171, it involves a practitioner positioning themselves in a one-armed handstand. While doing this, they project their aura from their hand in an explosive burst, propel themselves into the air and keep them in it for a moment, which creates the appearance of floating for a bit. The goal is for the person doing the exercise to launch themselves a few dozen centimeters. Reaching this goal means one can move on to the next level, but if they do not meet this goal, they simply keep doing the exercise until they can't maintain the handstand. Someone who has mastered this exercise can knock an opponent back a considerable distance with an emission attack, and this exercise shows that emission can be used to propel yourself like a rocket if used properly. According to Hiso's personality test, emitters tend to be impatient, not detail-oriented, short-tempered, and quick to react violently. While they can resemble enhancers in their impulsivity, he notes that emitters tend to calm down and forget much more easily. Due to the nature of emission abilities, many Nen abilities created by emitters are long-ranged. According to Furikop, the 10 of emitters is usually broader and will darken if the emitter attempts to shrink it. To me, at least, it sort of makes sense that emitters might tend towards an explosive personality, when emission is all about releasing the embodiment of emotions and life force and detaching it from your body. It could also be a reference to how aura normally fades quite rapidly after detaching from the body, but emission can be used to let the aura persist much longer while detached. So things that are ordinarily fleeting or temporary are much more exaggerated and persistent. I honestly couldn't give you a reason as to why emitters make the water change color during the divination test, other than Togashi needed a distinct new effect possibly. Maybe the color changing is supposed to represent emitted aura passing through the water, akin to some sort of wavelength of light or other particle. Maybe since emission has a connection to teleportation and spatial distortion, it represents some sort of distortion in the light with how it's moving through the water. The fact that the 10 of emitters usually takes up a larger area parallels how many emitters have long-range abilities, or separate their aura from their body. Okay, hello, Future Doug here. So earlier I mentioned how emission is specifically separating aura from your body, not just stretching it. And I wanted to clarify a little bit. So I think what's happening too with that misconception is people are assuming that emission is what makes something long range inherently, and that's not always true. For example, Machi's transmuted thread can actually stretch pretty far without emission, as we see in chapter 77, which uses this property to track Ubogen along with Kurapika and company. So there are ways, for example, like for transmuters to have longer range attacks by stretching their aura. But obviously, emitters are usually going to be more conducive to long-range attacks because they can separate the aura from the body and control it from a distance. And as we mentioned earlier, manipulators can also have some considerable range. They can like give stuff commands and have an attack from a range. So it's important to consider that, because I think people just look at it and go, "Ooh, long-range move. That means emission." Not necessarily. I mean, usually, but not always is the point. And Terrabellum's ability is actually also, once again, a good range of a short-range emission ability. You can have short-range emission abilities, you can have long-range transmutation abilities. Obviously, it's just going to be way harder to do certain things, and there's going to be certain limitations. Like Machi cannot like detach her string and like move it from a distance. There's going to be a thread leading directly to her, because it has to be attached to her body to feed it aura. So I guess my point here is the how is pretty important. Not whether just if it does A or B. It's like how is it functioning? Like, yes, there are certain things only specific Nen types can do, but that's because of how the Nen type works. For example, back to Emission and Conjuration, they both excel at cutting off spaces, but the difference between them is how they do that. It's not just like, oh, it's cutting off a space, so it's Emission. Oh, it's cutting off a space, so it's Conjuration. How is that happening? Like for emitters, they're messing with space itself. For conjurers, they're applying rules or just sealing it off, etc. Specialization, for real this time. Specialization is one of the most mysterious Nen types, not only because of how it can include things that fall outside the other Nen types, or even resemble and include other Nen types within said specialist ability, but also how it's handled within the story itself, even if there are some implications we can read into. There's some key stuff in Specialization that has yet to be stated directly in the story. If someone performs the water divination test and the effect is different from any of the other Nen types we've gone over so far, then it's the indicator that the test taker is a specialist. So if the water's level doesn't increase, change flavor, gain impurities, change color, or the leaf doesn't move, then it is the sign of a specialist. This means that each specialist can create results that are different from even other specialists. For example, when 4th Kakian Prince Saradnik performs the divination test in chapter 376, the water begins to boil and release a putrid scent. But when Kurapika took the water divination test in chapter 386, the water's color changed and the leaf on top of it begins to spin. Kurapika's results also show us that specialists can have results resembling a combination of what other Nen types may get. On its own, a leaf spinning in the water could easily be considered the leaf moving in some form. The color changing fits in line with the results of an emitter taking the test, but both happening at the same time seems to mark Kurapika as a specialist. I mentioned how the results of the divination test can tell us about the character's personality, but this seems to be extra true for specialists, since their abilities as a whole could be anything and on an individual level vary on a case-by-case basis. This is usually the part where I go over some of the other ways we've seen specialization in order to get across what it actually does. But the thing about specialization is it can be just about anything, and while specific specialists can have very distinct effects that are clearly apart from the other Nen cat types, some can have abilities that greatly resemble or incorporate other Nen types. In chapter 408, Morena, who is a specialist herself, says, quote, "Other types have limitations. For example, a transmuter will have a hard time learning a manipulation technique because it is on the other side of the Nen chart. But specialists don't have those restrictions. The only downside to this is that specialists are so proficient that they often don't realize they're specialists and end up overtraining in a specific category, then regretting it later. But if a specialist knows their type from the get-go, they can work on high difficulty techniques that require deep mastery of multiple Nen types, or even create unique abilities that don't fit into any category." Unquote. Morena then goes on to say that she herself is a specialist, and her contagion allows her allies to unlock Nen abilities through a point-based system that is an incredible mix of all 6 Nen categories. So this means that specialization can and has been combined with one or more other Nen types, which can further muddle how easy it is to recognize and identify. However, there are some kinds of Nen techniques that seem unique to specialization or sit outside the other standard categories. Zrednik Hui Gyo Ro and Neon Nostrade both have abilities that let them divine the future to one degree or another, and it seems to me like future sight is a specialist thing. There are also characters like Turtle Lucifer and Leo who are capable of taking the abilities of others. In chapter 98, when Zeno and Silva are fighting Krollo, Zeno realizes that Krollo's ability is one that lets him steal the abilities of others, and not only concludes that this would require him to meet 4 or 5 conditions, but identifies him as a specialist with this information alone, which points to the idea that being able to outright steal abilities and use them for yourself is a specialist thing, or at least not unheard of for specialists. Now, like with everything else, talking about specialization's place in the Nen chart is sort of complicated, nuanced, and mysterious. First off, the reason manipulation and conjuration are to the left and right sides of specialization in particular is not because they have any affinity for specialization, but because they are the most likely to become specialists later in life, at a whopping 1% as stated in chapter 83 by Izunami. So for every 100 manipulators and or conjurers, one of them will probably become a specialist later in life. This can happen from a variety of factors, like bloodlines, when a particular person does enough training, etc. It's pretty clear based on the wording that it's not that manipulators and conjurers are the only ones that can become specialists, just the most likely. So we have yet to know if the placement scales to the rest of the Nen chart. For example, if conjurers and manipulators are the most likely to become specialists, then are enhancers the least likely, even if the chance is already extremely low? Or is the rate for becoming specialists with the other Nen types outside of conjuration and manipulation around the same? You also can't half-ass being a specialist. While with, say, transmutation you can learn enhancement or even manipulation without having a natural affinity for those categories yourself, even if it will take longer to learn and scale less effectively, you cannot use specialization without being a specialist. However, some specialists seem capable of using other Nen types, since Morena says her ability is a mix of every Nen type, and it's possible for a specialist to spend too much time honing the wrong category, as some specialists can learn or practice other Nen types, even if the opposite isn't true for the other Nen types. Thanks to Kurapika and his scarlet eyes, we know it's even possible to be a conditional specialist. Kurapika is normally a conjurer, but becomes specialist, as long as his eyes are red. So what's a specialist affinity for other Nen types? The canon answer is we don't know. My best guess is because specialization is so individualistic and case by case in every other respect, I have to assume it just depends on the individual. But let's go through some of the common misconceptions to at least narrow down what we know. I've seen some people argue that specialists must follow the logic of every other Nen type, and have an 80% affinity for the nearest manipulation and conjuration categories, a 40% affinity for enhancement, the further category, and 60% for the remaining emission and transmutation category. This doesn't really make any sense, because if that were the case, the manipulators and conjurers would probably just have an 80% in specialization instead of just 0%, with a 1% chance of becoming one. Kurapika in his Emperor Time also disproved the notion that all specialists follow the standard affinity lineup. Contrary to common misconception, Emperor Time does not give Kurapika 100% affinity for every Nen type. In chapter 108, Kurapika explains that what Emperor Time actually does is grant him mastery over Nen with 100% accuracy, 100% force for each category, but with conjuration as a point of reference. For example, in his words, he states that if he were to use an emission while in Emperor Time, it would increase his force and accuracy, but not the level or affinity itself, which would put him on par with a level 4 emitter but still leave his emission at 40% affinity, even if it is unnaturally more effective than it would be for normal conjurer. If you believe specialists have a 80% affinity for conjuration, this would make Kurapika's example make no sense, since he would have a 60% affinity for emission due to the category being closer to specialization, but completely opposite of conjuration. This would also mean that Kurapika's affinity for conjuration would actually drop and he would become worse at it, going from a level 10 conjurer to a level 8 if we use this example. And that doesn't seem to be the case. We also get so much of Kurapika's perspective in inner monologues that I think if he was literally becoming worse at conjuration, it would have come up as a vital detail. You could also, I'm saying this in post, you could also argue that it could boost Kurapika's conjuration if he was really bad at conjuration or not using it at 100% effectiveness, but I don't think that's true. Kurapika seems like an extremely competent Nen user, so I don't agree with the argument that Kurapika is like using his conjuration like terribly or anything, and that Emperor Time would push it to 100%. We also know that Emperor Time uses Kurapika's placement as a conjurer by default, so it's not like his affinity for any category outside of Transspecialization is changing, just his mastery, force, and accuracy of them. So to me, the most logical conclusion is that when Kurapika is in Emperor Time, he is a specialist that has 100% affinity in Specialization and Conjuration, 80% in Transmutation, 60% in Manipulation, and Enhancement with a 40% in Emission, all of which have a 100% force and accuracy within those percentages. I've also seen people argue that specialists must be like a sort of avatar or mistborn that can use every Nen type with 100% affinity, but as I've gone over, Kurapika actually disproves this because there are some limits with his affinities. So this leaves a couple possibilities. The first is what I suggested earlier. It's simply a case-by-case basis, and each specialist has a different affinity spread. This is also in line with Morena's point about specialists accidentally pouring too much time in the wrong Nen type. Since if someone like Kurapika is implied to have 100% affinity in another type outside of Specialization, or if a specialist could just have a really high affinity in another Nen category, then it might be easy to assume Kurapika is still just a really good conjurer, or for someone who hasn't taken the divination test, to just assume their type is something else. The other possibility could be that it just depends on how you become a specialist. It's possible that if you become a specialist later in life, after having already been another Nen type, your affinities may just stay where they are outside of Specialization. But if you're a specialist from the start, you either have a more traditional affinity spread, or it varies from individual to individual. However, even with this point, the traditional affinity spread still doesn't make the most sense to me, because Crollo and Leol seem to be able to steal other abilities no matter the Nen type once they meet the right conditions, without any decrease in effectiveness or in issues. In fact, with Crollo, Postmortem Nen can actually make some of his stolen abilities stronger. So either their abilities let them circumvent this Nen affinity factor anyway, or their affinity is sort of conditional, allows them to use any stolen abilities perfectly. There's also the chance that when it comes to Specialization's flexibility, Morena is partially referring to Contagion. Contagion can grant the infected Nen abilities, but it does seem to have some restrictions. One potential one is that the ability matches the user's own Nen type, and so far, all the abilities we've seen granted by Contagion fall under one Nen type that is in line with the user's natural affinity. So what Morena could be getting at is granting a specialist an ability with Contagion when they don't already have one. It could allow her ability to circumvent some of these usual limitations that other targets have by using a specialist ability to access the other Nen types. This possibility is backed up by Morena saying that she will tell Borgson what kind of power she wants Borgson to obtain if she picks the right card in Chapter 408. So to summarize the affinity spread of specialists, canon answer: we don't know yet. We just straight up don't know. It's still up in the air. My answer: each individual specialist probably has their own affinity spread. Possible third answer: it depends on when and how you became a specialist. Fourth possibility is that the affinity specialists have in other categories is somehow variable. It's possible that these affinities can rise or drop depending on how much time a specialist sinks into each Nen type, or that they can otherwise somehow be allocated based on conscious and/or unconscious choices and habits. A specialist who is a conjurer, or normally or otherwise practices a lot of conjuration, might just end up with a higher affinity for conjuration than a specialist that doesn't. It would both explain why Kurapika's affinities remain the same and what Morena is talking about, since a specialist could end up increasing their affinity with a particular Nen type and just assume that they are said Nen type. It also explains why she wants to find specialists before they awaken to Nen, but she has more control in molding their abilities and affinities. The fifth possible answer has to do with how Morena's Contagion works, and the combination of Contagion and a specialist target can allow for a wider variety of techniques and possibilities. The fifth potential answer: Togashi's out to fuck with me in particular. We don't have any info on specialist-specific training. It makes sense since each individual specialist can have wildly divergent abilities amongst one another, and their abilities aren't necessarily going to be restrained by some of the traditional category restrictions of Nen. So what you'd need to do to actually practice specialization outside of general Nen fundamentals would be something that literally depends on each individual specialist. And there would be no general rules of specialization to go by outside of maybe some general commonly recurring types of abilities, like ones that can take the abilities of others. The only thing it really seems like there is to go off of would be vibes, personality, mindset, instinct, and the specific results of the water divination test. According to Hiso's personality test, specialists tend to be both independent and charismatic. They don't usually say anything important about themselves and tend to refrain from making close friends, but they have a natural charisma that attracts others and always surrounds them with many people. There's definitely emphasis on specialists as a sort of outlier with this diagnosis. Someone who maybe can't fit in as well or open up as easily as other people, but this unique individuality attracts others and makes them stand out. This is reflected in how their abilities can be unique or one of a kind, and evenly seemingly bend or ignore certain rules of Nen. Something that is also portrayed in how each specialist can have a different result from the water divination test, and also have wildly different abilities that cannot just be learned by anyone. The fact that these abilities can't be merely copied by non-specialists could also point to the idea that specialists have unique mindsets or personalities that others could lack, and as such have different limitations. Nen Chart Placement. Now that we've gone over all the Nen types, I think it would be interesting to take a step back and look at the Nen chart as a whole. I took a bit to look for any patterns or logic as to why the Nen types were placed where they were, and I might have found something, although all this is speculation. It seems like manipulation and conjuration in the southern quadrant of the chart might represent a certain level of physicality or focus on the physical world, while transmutation and emission are all about controlling your aura directly. This is not to say that these categories can't be used to affect aura and physical things specifically, but let's break this down a bit. As we have gone over, manipulation is about infusing your aura into something in order to exert control over it. Usually this is going to be a physical object or substance, and even when manipulation is being used to open someone's nodes or alter memories, you are still manipulating that person's physical body and or mind, i.e. the brain. Conjuration is obviously about manifesting physical objects with your aura or physically turning existing objects into something else. On the other hand, emission is about detaching your aura from your body, and transmutation is about changing the properties of your aura, which we know can include things like aura shape. Continuing down this route, we can also see a sort of duality with some of the Nen types placed opposite of each other. Manipulation is usually going to be used as a way to control physical substances and objects, while transmutation is usually what allows you to control and shape your aura directly. Conjured objects have a certain level of staying power and or permanence, as mentioned earlier, so some specific conjured objects you could separate from your body, but only as specific physical objects, while emission seems to be detaching raw aura and by extension allowing you to remotely influence it. This also creates what I think could be interesting physical and aura pairs. Emission and manipulation on one side with conjuration and transmutation on the other. I think both pairs do also share similarities too. Manipulation requires being able to infuse your aura into an object, so it makes sense it would be next to emission, which is just separating your aura from your body. Conjuration is about creating physical things, so it makes sense that it would be next to transmutation, the Nen category about giving your aura the properties of things that a conjurer might be able to summon or create in its entirety. The Nen types are then bisected down the middle of the chart by enhancement and specialization, but why that is leaves me less certain, because I don't really see how enhancement parallels or contrasts specialization, if at all, because specialization can literally be anything. It's possible that they represent some sort of weird balance reinforced by how they split down the middle of the chart, or Togashi ran out of interesting places to put them, and just wanted to make sure all the categories were balanced, or I'm just reading too much into this. It's also that there's a pattern of physical and aura, with specialization being an outlier at the beginning and end of the loop, with manipulation emphasizing physical control, emission detaching aura from your body, enhancement boosting the efficiency and or strength of physical things, transmutation emphasizing changing your aura, and conjuration focusing on creating physical objects. The Hunter x Hunter Phantom Wiki also proposes that the Nen types at the bottom half of the chart, so manipulation, conjuration, and specialization, tend to rely more on restrictions, conditions, limitations, etc., than the three Nen types at the top of the chart, emission, enhancement, and transmutation. This isn't confirmed or said to be 100% true, but it does seem to generally be the case, and we know that some believe enhancers don't even need abilities to function well. But sealing an ability as a specialist requires 4 to 5 conditions to be met, and specialization abilities usually seem more specific. Manipulation and conjuration usually control or create specific things, and specialists seem to have strict rules they need to follow despite their general uniqueness. Emitters can just fire raw blasts of aura, and transmuters do allow for more flexibility than conjurers, in a sense, because you can pick and choose more due to not being forced to recreate an object in its entirety. Rihan also says that emitters and enhancers are more likely to have a spray and pray tactic, in which they activate techniques repeatedly or have more chances to counter its predator in chapter 388. It's possible that a major factor for why Togashi put the Nen types where they are is simply for more game balance reasons. For example, the only affinity opposite of enhancement is specialization. We learn from chapters like Izunabi that enhancement is extremely helpful and important to combat, and all the other Nen types don't have an affinity for enhancement that is below 60%. The one opposite to enhancement is specialization, which seems to be able to break certain rules of Nen or have abilities that let someone utilize other Nen types or affinities anyway. This means no Nen type is inherently just impossibly dog shit at reinforcing and protecting their body, since they can at least reach above a 50% in enhancement. I also have to imagine some are further from enhancement, because types like manipulation and conjuration have more potential to be OP with a higher ranking enhancement than other categories, or it's a sort of trade-off for being able to summon objects or control something to do the fighting for you. While you could say this means emission is OP because it allows for more range while being next to enhancement, it does seem like enhancement is restricted to physical targets. So I'd be surprised if someone enhanced a blast of aura, even if enhancing a thrown projectile like a rock, enhancing the user of a blast, or boosting something from a distance certainly is possible. Being able to both conjure things efficiently and enhance those same conjurations better than other Nen types seems less balanced than keeping them distant. It may also play into the physical aura pattern on the chart. with Conjuration creating physical objects, Transmutation altering one's own aura, Enhancement boosting the natural properties of physical objects or one's own body, Emission separating aura from one's body, and Manipulation controlling physical objects. This way, no one Nen type, except Specialization sometimes, has a monopoly on abilities that focus on aura and abilities that focus on the physical world. I think the way the Nen chart is set up also prevents Enhancement from being an overpowered Nen type. The thing about Enhancement is that even at its most basic, boosting the durability of an object, there would almost be no reason to ever not use it without proper balancing. However, Enhancement is sandwiched between two categories that do not give it physical things to enhance. You cannot enhance raw emitted aura because it is not a physical thing, even if said aura can carry the effects of Enhancement to a more distant target, and Transmutation is still aura and not an object. So if you transmuted a limb, you could not enhance the limb directly, even if the limb has the ability to enhance other physical things. The reason Hisoka doesn't use Enhancement on his bungee gum to make it even stronger, or Gon doesn't use Enhancement on his Jajankan scissors and Jajankan paper is either because the amount of aura to do this is not worth the trade-off, or, more likely, they cannot because you cannot use Enhancement to enhance your own raw aura. And being unable to enhance your own raw aura also makes sense because there has to be some sort of limitation on that, or also just cycle indefinitely where you just keep enhancing it and enhancing it like a weird loop. So there's probably almost definitely some sort of limitation on that. Now, if you conjure a limb, certainly you can use Enhancement to increase said limb's strength or other attributes. But the thing about that is Enhancement is actually kind of far from Conjuration and Manipulation on the Nen chart, which means it will take a considerable amount of time to learn if you're a conjurer or vice versa if you're an enhancer. And why worrying about conjuring a whole new object to enhance when you could probably just use an existing object, especially if Conjuration is probably not your specialty in the case of enhancers. Of course, if you're a transmuter, you sit smack dab between Conjuration and Enhancement, but then you probably want to try to focus a bit more on Transmutation before you start messing around too much with Conjuration and Enhancement. In Chapter 60, when Wing is describing the Nen chart, he helps conceptualize it by breaking the Nen types into two ideas. The aptitude one gets at birth, and the ones we acquire during our lifetime. He uses Gon as an example, by saying Gon has a supple and agile muscular structure that he was born with, but he developed the accuracy of his five senses by playing. So we can assume that either intentionally or unintentionally, Nen represents a marriage of these two ideas, which is sort of alluded to in how each Nen category has vague, not always accurate archetypes for those that fall under its affinities. There are some limitations we are born with or have a proclivity towards, but that does not mean everything is completely static or unchanging. Some things can be honed, neglected, or changed. This is sort of reflected in the Nen categories themselves. While it's certainly possible to dive into the categories first from your own to great effect, Wing says in Chapter 60 that acquiring an ability that falls under a Nen category you don't have a good affinity for requires excessive efforts and strong character. However, Bisky says in Chapter 144 that you shouldn't only stick to learning your own Nen type, and learning other Nen types can make you more flexible and well-rounded. The ideal spread is a kind of bell curve, with your own Nen type being the highest point you spend the most time practicing, and each of the other Nen categories having less and less time devoted to them, the farther away they are from your Nen type. So an enhancer would want to practice Enhancement the most, followed by Transmutation and Emission as the second most practiced categories, with Manipulation and Conjuration being the Nen categories they spend the least amount of time practicing. There's also something to be said about Nen in connection to the life force and willpower. There's of course the fact that Nen can become stronger the more willpower you have, but Nen is also powered by life force. Something I think is fascinating is that despite being a kind of life force, or seems to have a strong connection to death. Certain abilities can actually become stronger after death or in response to the act of it despite being powered by life force. You could see this as a manifestation of someone pouring all their life force into something, or the lasting effect someone's life could have on the world. A sort of tangible representation of their legacy or passion. In many stories, life force is depicted as an inherently good, healing, or benevolent force, but this does not seem to be the case with Aura and Nen. While Aura definitely can be harnessed for more benevolent purposes, it is clearly a more neutral force, with even a basic malice-infused Ren being capable of physically and or mentally harming someone that isn't well protected. Possible this could showcase how not every instance of willpower or intent is good, and how not everyone dedicates their life to doing good or nice things. If you get attacked by someone with a strong enough malicious intent, you could die or have your own willpower and strength save you. Finally, you have conditions, limitations, and risk. The greater limitations / condition, the more aura one can draw out. To me, this has always been sort of intuitive as a way of showing how making certain sacrifices or allocating your life to certain things can show your passion or yield results later. This is purely how I visualize this, and it isn't supported in canon text, but sometimes I think of aura as a faucet or nozzle with limitations / conditions, giving the faucet more focus or a tighter nozzle, and thus increasing the water pressure and strength at the cost of decreasing the range of spread and influence. So limitations could also represent something akin to this focus and risk with how much you're willing to give up to achieve a goal. You could ultimately see a Nen battle as not just a battle of strength, but a battle of wills and ideology. Someone who is willing to die for a cause is more likely to win a fight than someone who isn't. Of course, a lot of Nen is literally just magic that happens in the story, so I'm in no way trying to imply that Nen and Aura are purely metaphorical and not real in the world of Hunter x Hunter. But in the same way Hatsu and Nen abilities are often symbolic of the characters that wield them, then Aura and its types in general might be too. So I didn't know where else to put this, but in chapter 137, Bisky says there's actually a lot of children who can use Nen. It's just rare to find strong ones or ones who are capable of fighting exceptionally well. So Nen is a more common phenomenon than it might first seem, and it could convey the idea that only a few people have a ton of willpower, conviction, and talent, while also showing that there are aspects of the world and society not everyone can see. Morena also connected her own research about the likelihood of people falling to different Nen types. Morena herself emphasizes that this may not be 100% accurate, as it's only based on her personal experience and isn't an official peer-reviewed study or anything. In chapter 408, Morena says that it seems people statistically have a 27% chance of being an enhancer, 24% chance of being an emitter, 19% chance of being a transmuter, 15% chance of being a manipulator, and a 15% chance of being a conjurer, and a 0.033% chance of being a specialist. I would take this statistic with a grain of salt, but it's interesting that enhancement seems to be the most common, followed by emission. I wonder if it is because these Nen categories can be more straightforward in either personalities or function, or if it's because the further you get from specialization in the chart, the more common the category, with specialization itself being the rarest category. Other Nen ability classifications. Since I went over some of the different subclassifications when talking about manipulation, I might as well go over some of the other groupings of Nen. These kinds of categories are grouped by similarities in function or traits the Nen abilities within them share, but I'd argue that they are not as important as the 6 Nen types, since you aren't born with an affinity for them in the same way, even if some Nen classifications require the use of specific Nen types. For this section, I'll just go through this list of subcategories in the order they appear on the wiki, so alphabetical, and look for where the classification is mentioned and what it entails. Some classifications of Nen are definitely more important than others. For example, curses end up being referenced a lot in Hunter x Hunter and can be very dangerous. Barrier types are mentioned in chapter 398, along with landmine types. They are described as Nen abilities in which multiple traps can be set over a wide area using Aura-infused tools, such as charms, ropes, tags, etc. that act as triggers. So basically, they're sort of like booby traps that are set off once a specific trigger is activated, kind of like a metaphorical or literal tripwire. We don't know much about the collaborative type abilities, but they are alluded to in chapter 375, when the chapter touches on 5th Prince Tubepa's guardian Nen beast. The Nen beast itself is a transmuter that requires a research colleague, so we can assume that abilities within this classification require 2 or more parties to work together in order to achieve an effect. In chapter 376, Zhang Li's guardian Nen beast is revealed to be a conjurer with a composite/compound type ability. The said ability is one that activates multiple abilities upon satisfying multiple conditions. Specifically, when the owner of a coin satisfies said conditions, multiple abilities will be invoked. So we can assume that Nen abilities classified as composite or compound types are like clusters of multiple abilities that activate in tandem, or a single ability that grants multiple other abilities, like a 2-for-1 deal. Counteractive type abilities are ones that activate in response to the user taking damage to perform a counterattack or strike back. The act of striking second acts as a risk to boost the power of the ability, and the more risk the user runs, the more powerful the ability. Additionally, the greater the damage suffered, the stronger the ability's counter will be. In chapter 373, when its second Kakian Prince Camilla was shot and killed, her ability activated and killed the attacker before using the attacker's own life force to heal and revive Camilla. The weakness of these kinds of abilities seems to be that there may be ways to incapacitate their users without actually injuring or killing them in order to avoid triggering their ability. In chapter 375, Shikaku seems afraid of Prince Hulkenberg's Nen beast having a counteractive ability that can rewrite memories upon activation. So it's clear that counteractive abilities can do more than just outright kill or hurt an assailant in response to an attack, by scaling or responding in other ways. Curses are basically exactly what they sound like, using Nen to apply a curse as a persistent negative effect. In chapter 120, the classification is explained in more detail. They tend to be quite dangerous because of their long-lasting effects, and due to the fact that they are often created from a place of negative emotion. So the death of the person who inflicted the curse can actually make it stronger instead of weakening it, due to the mechanics of post-mortem Nen. It is possible to remove a curse, but this is noted as being extremely hard to do. Those who can actually lift or remove curses are known as exorcists, but exorcism is an extremely rare skill/ability. In chapter 325, Morrell says that the Hunters Association has 1 exorcist amongst their ranks. In chapter 120, Fink says that there are fewer than 10 exorcists in the world that can lift curses set by those who have died. A diffusive levy type ability, which I've also seen translated as collecting dispersal type or scattering/collecting type, is the kind of ability Prince Tyson's Nen beast makes use of, and diffusive levy abilities are implied to be those that gather something from multiple targets using various agents in chapter 375. For example, Tyson's Nen beast is an emitter that spits out little tadpole-esque things that absorb aura from followers of Tyson's teachings, and in return gives them feelings of happiness. Double/doppelganger abilities are explained in chapter 53 as abilities that create a copy of the user. This involves conjuring a double and then controlling it with manipulation. In chapter 368, Hanzo explains that there are automatic clones and clones that are controlled directly. Doubles that are directly controlled allow for greater precision at the cost of greater restrictions. In Hanzo's case, his actual body is in a defenseless, unconscious state, and waking it up causes his clone to disappear. While automatic doubles require a lot less focus, if any, they cannot carry out more complex orders as a trade-off, leaving the user with less control over them. Exorcism is something that we touched on twice already, but for the sake of organization and metaphorical balance within this article, I will also cover it here. Those with the ability to lift curses are known as exorcists, and this is an extremely rare skill. Morrell says that the Hunters Association has 1 exorcist among its members, and in chapter 325 and in chapter 120, Fink says that there are fewer than 10 exorcists in the world that can lift curses set by those who have died. The act of exorcism virtually always imposes a negative condition or drawback on the one removing the curse. In chapter 147, Almagon has to carry around a Nen beast that has eaten the target curse, a bomb set by Genthru, with the creature's size seemingly correlating to the strength of the curse, and the Nen beast remaining until he can meet the conditions to undo the curse. Additionally, curse that's too powerful has a chance of killing the user, and apparently this creature cannot remove curses laid by the dead. In chapter 261, Hina has to deal with her stomach growing bigger in correlation to the strength of curses she ingests. And in chapter 325, the exorcist brought to heel Gon by the Hunters Association freaks out and says she could not hope to remove it with her ability. So exorcism seems to have very big limitations and drawbacks for most people. With the info we have on exorcists, we can assume that exorcism abilities could potentially refer to abilities that exorcise curses. Even Nanika's wishes do have very strict rules they follow, even if the burden of the wishes does not fall on Killua or Nanika herself, but anyone else who makes a subsequent wish instead. In chapter 389, we learn of the have-nots Nen ability, Yomotsu Higui, we who are born out of convenience, which is apparently a haunting type ability. The classification is for abilities that activate after the death of a user to possess a specific target and bring them harm in a variety of ways, implying a massive overlap with curse type abilities, even if curse abilities don't always require the death of the person invoking them. It is currently unrevealed if there are haunting types that wouldn't qualify as curses, or if all haunting types are a type of curse. Yomotsu Higui specifically is described as an assassination curse that requires the user to carry something related to the target, such as their name, photograph, or part of their body, and staying as close to the target for as long as possible. The greater your desire for killing the target, the stronger the curse grows. Once these activation conditions have been met, the ability would be activated upon the user's death. Where someone dies seems to matter a great deal because in chapter 389, the narrator says ideally the one invoking the curse should kill themselves in front of the target's eyes, and Fukutake explains how the farther away the user is from the intended target, the longer it will take for the curse to run its course. And in the presence of such strong guardian spirit beasts, possessed by each of the Khaki princes, the user needs to have the resolve to get close to a prince before touching them and killing themselves within said prince's field of view. Yomotsu Higui steals the aura of the cursed until it kills them. At its most powerful, it can lock the target into a state of Zetsu and kill them in a few hours. However, when talking about its range, Fukutake says that if it was cast safely from the room she is in, it would take 3 months for the curse to kill the target prince, if 3 people all cast it on the same target. On the other hand, if the character Mozuba used it from the room 1002, it would take 10 days. But Mashush and Taylor performing the exact same action with the same Nen ability from the same position would take 2 weeks to kill the target. Landmine type abilities are mentioned in chapter 398, along with barrier types. Landmine types involve a trigger that is made by applying Nen directly to a specific place. This limitation means that it is limited to 2 to 3 spots, but tends to have more powerful influence behind it. In chapter 388, Kurapika refers to a stealth dolphin as a lone/sliding type ability. And the term seems to refer to abilities that can transfer a Nen ability to someone else so they can use it in place of the original Nen user. Kurapika's Stealth Dolphin, Awakening Oito to Nen in chapter 369, lets us know that these kinds of abilities can act as a form of initiation and awaken those unable to use Nen already to Aura. This is also reinforced by Kurapika using Stealth Dolphin to awaken all the students in his class to Nen. The term Nen Beast is another important class of Nen abilities that gets thrown around a lot within Hunter x Hunter. I would say it's up there with curses as far as importance and consideration. The term Nen Beast seems to refer to creatures, automata, or other such animated or living entities created from Nen, and generally they tend to resemble people, animals, or some mix of both. Although this isn't a hard rule or anything since there are Nen Beasts that look more like objects, such as Kurapika's Stealth Dolphin and Kite's Crazy Sloth's Clown, or abstracts, such as the Kakian Guardian Spirit Beast. They are usually created via conjuration, but there are other ways to create Nen Beasts, or at least things that resemble them, that don't utilize the Nen type. For example, in chapter 244 and chapter 202, Merle can use his deep purple ability to create constructs that resemble and move like animals, such as humans and rabbits, using what is a mix of manipulation on the smoke he makes, and probably emission if we consider the detached aura cores he has to make with the orders for such constructs. Bisky seems to use transmutation to create Cookie, but I can't find exactly which is confirmed if that's the case. However, we do know it is possible to make constructs resembling or acting like living creatures with transmutation, since Zeno uses that Nen Kagure to give his aura the properties and shape of dragons, while Sadasu transmutes his aura into an arm, something that would otherwise be a living body part. Future Doug here. So in chapter 171, Bisky actually does confirm that the lotion/ointment Cookie is making is actually made from transmuted aura, although I still can't verify if Cookie herself, like her physical body, is transmuted aura, or if it's a conjured physical body and then Cookie can then transmute aura into lotion. According to Rihan in chapter 374, Nen Beasts are usually made to serve one of 3 broad functions. 1. To increase the user's number of allies and control said Nen Beasts. 2. To put more pressure and strain on the enemies while cutting down the number of said enemies. And 3. To take something from those affected by the Nen Beast as a way of increasing the strength of the Nen Beast or its user. In chapter 360, Bill correctly speculates that the Kakian Prince's Guardian Spirit Beasts are some sort of parasitic type ability. Kurapika asks if this kind of ability is somewhat like a curse before Bill confirms, and elaborates by saying parasitic abilities utilize the aura of the host to use its ability, and it can materialize in many different forms. Parasitic types act without the host being aware, and their host can't actually control them. Despite this, not every parasitic type seems like it produces negative effects or curses. Some parasitic abilities actually protect their host and can even attack a target in defense of the host. So parasitic abilities cannot be controlled by the host directly and feed on their aura. According to Bill in chapter 362, parasitic type abilities can be unpredictable because of the fact that feeding on their host's aura can cause them to become greatly influenced by their host's personality and thoughts, and or feelings. This means parasitic nen beasts are a mixture of both the thoughts and goals of the person that created them and the thoughts and goals of their host, which can create what Bill describes as a very tangled and complex life form. This can be seen in how the guardian spirit beasts of the Khaki princes are often very inhuman or abstract looking, while containing traits from multiple creatures and or concepts. The ideal target for parasitic abilities seems like it would usually be non-users, because a parasitic ability can feed on the residual aura that leaks away from the body of the user, and said user may not notice their aura is being fed on, since they would just feel tired and not notice the amount of aura dropping if the parasite consumes a considerable amount of aura, as explained in chapter 360. In chapter 388, Kurapika refers to Bill's Erageron Hatsu as a supportive type, when pointing out that it's rare for male enhancers to have abilities that fall under this classification. We haven't gotten a lot of details about this classification, but we know that Bill's ability uses enhancement to accelerate the growth of living things. However, as explained in chapter 388, while it can be used on people to increase their Nen abilities, this aspect of the ability is weak on those who are untrained or lacking in proficiency with Nen, such as non-users. With this information, we can assume that supportive type just broadly refers to abilities not aimed at just increasing one's combat strength or engaging in direct combat. It probably also encompasses things like healing others. It could also refer to abilities that lend support to others as opposed to just affecting the user themselves, with things like a boost in power, vitality, healing, etc. Symbiotic/joint type abilities are collaborative abilities that require more than one Nen user to supply aura in order to use the ability or be effective. In chapter 347, Golem has two abilities that fall into this category. The first one is explicitly stated as being a left arm he can conjure on his mech suit. Said arm has a heavy weapon and a seat that an emitter can sit in to provide the weapon with aura to use as ammunition. Golem can also conjure guns that emitters can use to fire destructive den projectiles, which seems like it's probably also a symbiotic type. Quantifying Aura. Technically, given the parameters I gave for how I want to tackle Nen, this section should have appeared before going over the different Nen types and classifications. However, I felt that the ways Aura is quantified or presented actually make more sense if you already understand the different Nen categories, and I think the way Aura is quantified is actually more complicated than understanding each of the Nen types, because Aura quantification seems like it has more precise math involved. Cards on the table, while I could talk all day about the Nen chart itself, I'm not nearly as confident in my understanding of some of the math that seems to be going on with Aura quantification, so I apologize for any mistakes, and, like always, feel free to leave corrections in the comments. It does seem to be implied that someone's affinity for each of the Nen types is always at play, even when someone isn't using a specific ability. It's easy to just assume that if one is an enhancer, for example, their affinity for the category only matters if they are specifically using an enhancement Nen ability, but there's evidence that points to this not being the case. First off, in chapter 75, it seems Ubogen can shrug off bullets and rockets with what looks like red, and at the very least he isn't using any kind of unique ability. Enhancers are also noted as generally being more durable than the people who fall under the other categories. When Kurapika blocks bullets in chapter 68, he likes to do so with his dowsing chain, but when Bill, an enhancer, blocks bullets in chapter 364, he does it by using his arm to guard his vital organs. The exact caliber of bullets also seem to matter, since in chapter 401, Longi says a 22 caliber would be useless against Nen users in general, implying heavier calibers might be more effective or yield different results. We also know that some believe enhancers don't need to worry about making Nen abilities. In chapter 83, when Kurapika inquires if it's possible for him to create something that could overpower an enhancer, part of Izunabe's answer involves using an equation. He represents physical strength with AP, attack points, defense and durability with DP, defense points, and proficiency and enhancement with SP, spirit points, as a way of quantifying the values of one's offensive and defensive capabilities. So in this equation, attack points represent physical strength, defense points represent physical defense, and spirit points represent the proficiency someone has for enhancement. It's basically like a sort of enhancement Nen stat. In Izunabe's example, if an enhancer and conjurer possess equal strength and maximize their capacity for enhancement Nen, the enhancer performing the attack would be represented as having an AP attack points of 100 and an SP spirit points of 100, which could be written out as 100 AP plus 100 SP equals 200. The defending conjurer can have the amount of damage they would be able to block by replacing the variables representing attack points with defense points. And because a conjurer who has mastered enhancement would have a 60% affinity, they get 60 SP spirit points and end up with the equation 100 DP defense points plus 60 SP spirit points equals 160. You then get 200 for the strength of the enhancer's attack and 160 for the conjurer's defense, which you can then subtract to get 40, which Izunabe says is 40%. Implying all these numbers are percentages. This means that if the enhancer and conjurer are making perfect use of enhancement while having maxed out their strength, then the defending conjurer would suffer 40% of the damage from the enhancer's attack, while nullifying 60% of the blow. As you can tell, this is a simplified formula. In this example, we are assuming both parties are equal in strength and have mastered enhancement. It's totally possible that one could be physically weaker than the other by a significant margin, or not have as good a mastery of Nen and enhancement. You could definitely have an enhancer with an SP lower than 100, and a conjurer with an SP lower than 60 based on this information. You also have to consider the type of attack, since some Nen abilities might be hard or impossible to physically block, and things like location/environment can make all the difference. Going back to the more simplistic equation, Nen can still be complicated even in this simplified representation, because its power can fluctuate based on things like emotions, limitations, and just general mental state. Izanabe represents this variable by using MP, mystery points. If someone used a limitation to strengthen their will, their power can exceed what would otherwise be possible. If we go back to our defending conjurer, the equation we have for them was 100 DP plus 60 SP equals 160. However, when Izanabe adds the mystery points, it's added as a multiplier. So if the conjurer has the right limitations, they can end up with 100 DP plus 60 SP times 2 MP. If you do this equation in proper order, you multiply 60 and 2 to get 120 before adding 100 to end up with a final answer of 220. If we assume the enhancer is unchanged and has no mystery points added, this would leave the enhancer's attack value at 200, because it's unchanged. Meaning that thanks to the mystery points granted by the proper values and limitations, the conjurer's defense value actually exceeds the enhancer's attack value, and allows them to completely block all the damage from the enhancer's attack. However, limitations can be weird, and they don't always guarantee that those using it can manage to get a big enough boost. And in Chapter 83, Izanabe says that exceeding 100% of one's normal capabilities comes with risk. Going past your natural limits always comes with drawbacks, and increasing one's strength by surpassing this limit usually comes at the cost of something else that can create weak points, drawbacks, or even fatal results. So most Nen users lean towards more stable and consistent methods. In Chapter 108, when explaining Emperor Time, Kurapika breaks down one's mastery and affinity for a given Nen type into level, force, and accuracy stats. If someone with a natural affinity for Conjuration was a level 10, then they only get an 80% affinity in Transmutation, which at best would leave them only able to learn and perform Transmutation skills that are equal to or below that of level 8. This also applies to other Nen categories and their respective techniques. So level 6 abilities are below for Enhancement/Manipulation, and level 4 abilities are below for Emission. If this conjurer did the proper training and brought the Conjuration level up to the highest level, then the top level of the other categories would be limited proportionally to one's affinity for them. So 80% for the nearest, 40% for the farthest, and 60% for the remaining. So we can assume that if a conjurer reached level 80, then their Transmutation level could reach level 64. And if this conjurer reached level 100, they can use Transmutation techniques that are level 80 or lower. This is assuming the levels could even go that high though. However, just because a conjurer could use techniques falling under a different category within the level range doesn't guarantee the effectiveness or power of the technique would be as good when compared to someone with a natural affinity for the category performing it. In Kurapika's example, he says that while a conjurer could hypothetically create the same ability as a level 4 emitter, their effective output would pale in comparison to someone with a natural affinity for the Nen type. This is where force and accuracy or power and effectiveness come in. Force and accuracy are also affected by one's affinity for a Nen type, so this would mean if a level 10 conjurer used a level 4 emission ability, its force and accuracy would be a mere 40% of a level 4 emitter doing the exact same thing. And the emitter would have 100% force and accuracy for said emission technique, despite using the exact same technique at the same level. However, when Kurapika uses Emperor Time, his force and accuracy becomes 100% for each category, but his affinity remains the same, allowing him to make the most of each Nen category while surpassing what a normal conjurer could do. This also implies that there are certain emission techniques Kurapika can't use because you need a certain level of affinity for emission. But any of the emission techniques Kurapika could perform without Emperor Time basically become flawless versions with much more power, accuracy, and staying power. One of the more confusing ways of quantifying and calculating aura is the one Knuckle Buying explains in Chapter 211. Everyone makes fun of Gon for being bad at this math, but honestly I have a hard time understanding it too, and if you ask fans to explain what Knuckle is talking about, I doubt most could properly explain it. Heck, I'm not even sure I can properly explain it here. Okay, so basically what Knuckle is doing is converting aura into a numeric value along with how much is being used in a system, and he's doing this by using a process similar to finding out the capacity factor of a power plant, by substituting the power plant for the Nen user, and the energy created by the plant for the aura of the Nen user. For those who don't know what a capacity factor really is, the US Energy Information Administration, EIA, defines it on their website as, quote, the ratio of the electrical energy produced by a generating unit for the period of time considered to the electrical energy that could have been produced at continuous full power operation during the same period, unquote. So it seems like it's comparing how much energy a unit generated over a period of time versus how much it could have produced during the same time period if it was at full power. Similar to how we might measure electricity in something like watts, Knuckle measures aura using a, quote, unit, unquote, with the term aura referring to a unit of life energy. The amount of aura spent every second while in a state of battle is equal to about 1 unit per second. However, this can multiply by 6 or 10 times when Ryu, Ken, and Nen abilities are used, bringing up the potential rate of consumption to 6 to 10 units of aura per second. The less skilled the Nen user is and the more powerful a technique, the more aura they will consume. In combat, an inexperienced Nen user can end up consuming as many as 10 aura units per second. Since there are 60 seconds in a minute, this would mean that they burn 600 aura units per minute, and you can multiply 60 by 20 to come to the conclusion that an inexperienced Nen user can burn up to 12,000 units of aura over the course of 20 minutes. This allows Knuckle to assess how much aura his opponents spend in combat by the second to deduce how long they can keep using Nen, and seemingly how long it can take for his APR to take effect. This involves 3 parameters. First, there's maximum aura power, MAP, which is used to represent the maximum amount of aura an individual can store within their body, as explained in Chapter 211. This amount varies from individual to individual and can be increased over time with training. Then you have potential aura power, PAP. MAP is the maximum capacity of an individual, and PAP represents the remaining amounts of aura someone currently has in their body. So MAP is the maximum carrying capacity someone has, and PAP is how much aura is actually left within the body. If you have a glass of water and fill half of it with water, how much water it could actually theoretically fit without spilling would be the MAP, but how much water is actually in it at the moment would be PAP. Finally, you have actual aura power, AP, which represents the quantity of aura that's being used effectively in a given moment, i.e. the aura output. If we go back to the cup example, MAP would be how much water that cup could possibly store without spilling. PAP is how much water is currently in the cup, and AP is how much water is being poured out or used at a given moment. Having a high PAP, potential aura power, with a low AP, actual aura power, is meaningless, which is just a fancy way of saying that having a ton of remaining aura means nothing if you can't actually use it effectively or call upon enough of it at once. AP, actual aura power, can be increased through training, and how well someone can actually use Nen can influence these numbers. This can lead to a lack of practice or a lower affinity for a certain Nen category, causing the power of an attack to be lower than the amount of aura units expended. We can see an example of this in Chapter 209 when Gon uses Jajankan paper on Knuckle. Despite seemingly using the same amount of aura as its raw counterpart, it seems much weaker, and is actually weak enough for Knuckle to knock it out of the way. According to Knuckle, Gon's Jajankan exceeds over 2,000 aura units, but his Jajankan rock has a much greater force than his Jajankan paper, despite the presumably same amount of aura being consumed in each instance. Jajankan paper is noted as being around 25% of the power of Jajankan rock, so we can assume that the amount of effective aura units within the paper attack is a bit over 500. Nen Writing System? Question mark? Right. So I probably should have covered this earlier, but I wasn't really going to because there's not a lot of info, to be honest, but I changed my mind again. Also, I'm just adding this in because I'm too lazy to go through the effort of editing like 90 plus pages of writing, again, in order to make sure this fits smoothly when there's so little info on this topic. In Chapter 60, we are introduced to the concept of divine script. As explained by Square, it seems like it can be drawn on something like a boxing ring and then charged with Nen over time in order to boost the Nen abilities of the one who drew it later, as long as it is charged with aura and the inscriber is within a certain range. In Chapter 65, King seemed to have used a currently unnamed kind of inscription written on a plain piece of iron to help reinforce the box. Killua notes that it seems to have similar properties to Nen, and Gon compares the inscription to ones that were apparently on the promise string Wing gave Gon when he was banned from using Nen for 2 months. While the inscription seems to reinforce the box, applying aura to the box and the inscription inside seems to negate this property and make the wooden box containing it and the other contents fall apart. This does strengthen the comparison Gon makes to the promise string, since said string does indeed break when in Chapter 56, Gon uses Ted and applies enough aura in the same way. The box reinforced by the inscription seems to fall apart after being exposed to enough outside external aura. Wing also says that he uses his own Nen to get the string to function, so it seems both divine script and inscription require aura to power it like a battery. In Chapter 342, it looks like the Zodiacs using a handcuff that has a similar kind of appearance to the aforementioned divine script, and inscription to restrain beyond, which might imply that one, both, or similar kinds of inscription can be used to help restrain or monitor Nen users in some way. But this pattern could also just be a coincidence, or I am mistaken. There's always the chance that it's unrelated, depending on how much credit you want to give Togashi and or my perception. One thing I also wonder about is how do Nen types factor into this? Like, if you were storing the Nen within divine script, would emitters and manipulators have an easier time storing that much Nen? Or would it not matter? Is divine script just like doing its own thing? Spirits? Question mark? There's also potentially like spirits in Hunter x Hunter. They plagued Prince Fugetsu during the Succession War in places like Chapter 402, but when Benjamin acknowledges them, he says they are low-ranking curses that possess those with weak hearts and frail bodies. It doesn't appear to be Fugetsu's own Nen base or someone's plan, and he postulates that they may have latched onto her due to despair at losing Kacho, before saying she won't last another 10 days in that state. They can be scared off or warded off to exorcise them, but so far this has only been a temporary solution in both cases. In Chapter 400, Fugetsu tells Kacho that she can use her ability as much as she wants now, despite her worrying appearance and deteriorating condition. In the same chapter, Melody notes that her aura has dwindled so much it looks like she's using Zetsu, and the spirits are being drawn to her unstable heartbeat. Melody is also unable to identify what's causing the change or any evidence of trace aura possession. This could all just be a really subtle ability, but the wiki seems to be of the opinion that these could actually be their own entities that occur in the world. Ones that show up to haunt those who lack aura, a strong enough body, and a strong enough will. You could argue these spirits are a product of the Kakin Succession War, but if that is the case, then it seems strange Benjamin recognizes them as entities that target specific kinds of people. While it is indeed possible they are just a Nen ability, it's also possible they are preying on Fugetsu losing her will to live, or the ability of someone else leaves her open to these creatures. Only time will tell. Currently, I'm leaning towards more of the idea that they might be naturally occurring creatures of some sort, or parasites, that found an opening either from an ability or Fugetsu's own mental state, but again, we will see. Conclusion. Okay, that's about all I can think about covering. Major shout out to the Hunter x Hunter fandom wiki. While not everything they say I think is accurate, the way they have everything organized and sourced makes my job a lot easier. If you want more, hopefully shorter Hunter x Hunter content, be sure to let me know. If you're a fan of the Magnus Archives or Magic the Gathering, I have written stuff about that on YouTube, Tumblr, and Google Docs, which you can check out in the links down below. I'm going to go take a nap, and when I wake up, I better not see anyone asking the difference between Transmutation and Conjuration, or Manipulation and Emission. If you have any fan-made Nen users or Nen abilities, feel free to leave them in the comments. You can also leave any questions or things you think I missed or got wrong in the comments, and I might, if I get enough of them, I might make like a Q&A video going over those here. Also, if you want to support me monetarily, so I can keep making time to write stuff like this, you can visit my Patreon or Ko-Fi. I also make art. If you want to check that out on my Twitter and Instagram and stuff. Thank you for listening.